Kicking off the list at number 10, Gladiator Blood. Okay, nice and thirsty this morning, so let's talk about Gladiator Blood so we can get nice and hydrated for this video. When Charlie Sheen started talking smack about drinking dragon blood, everybody looked at him like this guy was insane. But back then, back in ancient Roman days, if you boasted about drinking gladiator blood, that's great, you were on the right track. Something's working for you, pal. Keep it up. Ancient Romans believed that gladiators had the literal heart of a lion, and to be fair, they were in immaculate shape and they looked like lions with their glorious hair. I'm attracted to Romans, most of them. So the thought process here, being extremely superstitious, was that if you drank said gladiator blood, whatever disease you had would soon be cured. Yes, the strong heart of a lion blood. Yeah, if you have some epilepsy, Roman physicians would tell you to drink some blood, like you're a vampire. Yeah, here you go. Here you go, Edward. Enjoy. Hope you feel better. Number 9, you're in trouble. Recently, we did a list on dark medical practices used in history, and in that list, we mentioned briefly about how urine was used by ancient Romans to whiten their smile. Yeah, fresh breath, not guaranteed, actually, this time at all. It's really not. It's the opposite, in fact. Well, to dive deeper into this gross, disgusting fact, ancient Romans also used urine to wash their clothes. Yep. That's so gross. I was like, I hope no one peeing on them. There we go. After they were done washing up, they would mask the smell, or at least try to, with leaves. Yeah, they would use bay leaves. Yeah, they didn't use soap because, well, the amount of ammonia in urine did the trick, so there was no need at that point. Yeah. Lye was also used to clean clothes at this time, but it was too pricey. So plan B was to head down to the, washrooms, the old ancient laundromat. Same thing, really, they're pretty close. And then everybody would catch up while, stomping and urinating and cleaning out their clothes. It was a good time. Number 8, new hair, new me. As soon as I cut my hair, I'm not gonna lie, I felt great. There's less weight on the neck, I could be more free in my silly movements when I do these lists. Glowing up these days is easier than ever. The tutorials on YouTube as well, you can learn how to do your brows while hearing true crime. It's amazing what we have nowadays. The Romans, not that easy. They had to do a little more work back then. If you were an ancient Roman and you wanted to show off the new you to your ex, maybe you're at a vomitorium party and you see your ex maybe perhaps, how would you dye your hair? How would you get their attention? How do you show Romulus that blondes do in fact do it better, right? Romans would have to use goat fat and beechwood ashes to bring out those highlights, yeah. Maybe it's goat fat, maybe it's Maybelline, maybe it's disgusting. It's definitely disgusting. Again, like those crazy Roman parties, this was a symbol of status, right? If your hair didn't reek of goat fat, who are you? You're not on the list, honey. Goat fat or bust. I don't speak broke. See ya. Emperor Claudius, his third wife, Valeria, apparently she once dyed her hair blonde and painted her entire body gold, and then had a contest to see who could hook up with the most Romans in one night. Yeah, Bachelor in Paradise, Pompeii edition. Tune in, tonight at 8. Number 7, sewer goddess. I love reading about ancient gods. It's my favorite topic. The Roman god of manure and fertilizer, for example. Where was that one in Hades? That would have been helpful. I would have beat that game in 8 minutes flat with him. The god of toilets. There's one we can't forget about either. Crepitus, okay? Every day we have to thank the god of toilets, right? If you haven't today, go ahead and thank them. The Romans regarded Glossina as the goddess of the main drain. The literal main drain to the city of Rome, all this water. This goddess was Glauca Maximum, aka big drain. Eventually, this god was affiliated with Venus, the goddess of beauty and love. Yeah, love me some big ass drains. Nice. That's a lie, actually. As a kid, I was so afraid of the bathtub drain. I would pull it and then just immediately high jump out of the tub. I don't want to get sucked down like Ant-Man. Know what I mean? Number 6, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they're trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired with an opponent that's somewhat equal. And then hundreds of people go, yeah, and they bet on you, and then see blood and stuff. It's horrible. But not all these gladiators are UFC fighters, okay? Not all of them are Kurt Russell and handsome. No, a great amount of these gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment, or they were slaves. Yeah, these prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger, believe it or not. They understood this was a one-way trip most likely, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even begun. This one story is quite haunting, but it makes total sense, sadly. 29 prisoners, they were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all strangled each other. They all took each other's lives with their bare hands because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare publicly. That's horrible. The reason this was the easier choice to make, sadly, was because saying no to the combat or to the games would just lead to an even more painful public execution. So it's a lose-lose, sadly. They sucked. Number 5, loincloths. Going back to ancient Roman and Egyptian times, here we go, 2 for 1. The loincloth was of course used by all. Either that or you would just be naked. I found this neat step-by-step on how to make your own loincloth, and I tried it, and it's way more complicated than I could have ever imagined, okay? We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence because these linens barely made it through a decade, obviously. There's not a lot of bones in them that would hang out over these thousands of years. But ancient Romans would often use leather to make underwear. Can you imagine that? Hot goat skin wrapped around your waist in the sun? Oh, I need baby powder just thinking about it right now. We still use leather today when it comes to undergarments and, you know, zippers and stuff, but that's for another video. We'll get to that another time. Number 4, cesspools. Hey, here's a note. If you're gonna make a massive castle, you need to know where not to build certain rooms, in case you're building a castle. Anyone watching? Like say over a cesspool, as an example. Yeah, don't build anything heavy over here, or else let's talk about it. Cesspools were often placed under floors, which makes sense because, you know, gravity and life and stuff. But you need to make sure those floors are supportive enough, period. That's it. Or else, this will happen. Back in 1183, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had a dinner in the palace of Erfurt. But in the main floor of the main hall broke open, resulting in a bunch of dinner guests falling through said floor, with even a few drowning again in said cesspool. Yeah, it's a horrible way to go. And then again, in 1326 in England, Richard the Raker had just sat down. The guy hasn't even started his meal yet, and then again the floor beneath him broke and he fell through and drowned in a cesspool. That's like the worst way to drown too. I'd say chamber pots were safer, but when it comes to waste, out of sight, out of mind. Sadly, just get that away from me. Just downhill, get it out, or else we'll drown in it, probably. Number 3, Roman shampoo. Okay, when my hair grew out over the pandemic, I had a panic attack. I don't know what the to do. I had a huge wake-up call. I've never had long hair before. I didn't know what to use in this mop. I still don't. Clearly, evidently, all I had growing up was the classic 4-in-1 shampoo for guys. That wasn't working out at all. That sucked. I needed some curl cream, okay? Separate jars of items, not just a 5-in-1 with mouthwash on your head. Those aren't good. Those don't do anyone any good. But the ancient Romans, they didn't have Head and Shoulders back then. What did they do? Well, sometimes nothing. They would dip their hair in cold water, and at public bathhouses also, very public, then they would rub and scrape away oils. Lime water was also used to wash your hair, but that was just as useful as lime wire. Sometimes Europeans wouldn't even use water at all to clean their head. They would rub their head with bran, like just a loose bran, before bed, and then they'd brush it out with a comb in the morning. Yeah, bran. I used dog shampoo once by accident. I thought that was bad. Bran? Be so itchy, I wouldn't sleep a wink. Number 2, ancient socks. Somebody got me socks over the holidays as a gift, and let me tell you, last year, I became a man. I was like, thank you, I actually love this. This is now the best gift of my life. Socks and lip balm, that's it. I don't want a PlayStation, get lost. Socks in ancient Greece, first of all, they weren't, you know, the ankle socks. There weren't Vans skateboarding socks. There weren't the weird grippy ones that kids have. Where were those growing up, first of all? Not even close. Socks came around in the 8th century BC, and it was made fresh from animal hairs. This led to Romans tying animal skins around their feet, and then, you know, tying it more and more and more and higher. Anything to keep it there. Now cut to the 2nd century AD in ancient Rome, the sock game finally got real. Romans began using fabrics instead of animal skins. It was now softer, it was lighter, and then later in the 5th century, socks were worn only by the most holy, which is kind of ironic because socks have holes in them. You get the joke, there it is. Socks were associated with the church. They were considered a symbol of purity. Socks would go all the way up your leg back then. Like I said, a little different than the New Balance ankle socks we got today. A little less holy. Finally, number 1, public bathhouse. This last one, okay, we haven't moved on from this at all. That's why I wanted to finish this list. Nice little fresh, fun reminder from Taylor McWaters. Here we go. We still bathe together, a lot. We go to water parks and we swim around in pools filled with pee. Ancient Roman bathhouses were the older, slightly yuckier versions of water parks. They would literally spread intestinal parasites. They were actually way worse. In these massive rooms with giant pools just lie disease. Nude, there were and everyone was sweaty and it was all tight and there was no filtration system. It was like an indoor hot tub without the pumps or the salts. It was gross. The Romans were literally figuring out sewage systems at the same time, which I of course mentioned earlier, but they were also the first to create heated public baths. Yeah, my above ground pool wasn't heated, but the ancient Romans, they had heated pools. Great, I gotta send an email to my dad this afternoon. Now I'm pissed. The archaeology and anthropology department at Cambridge discovered that Romans brought lots of parasites to Europe. Yeah, the fossilized feces showed that these heated, relaxing, rejuvenating bathhouses nearby were all but. Yeah, they were horrible. They were just spreading hot disease, coming in hot.
Number 10, Decimviri, the law of 12 tables. Well, actually the word means 10. 10 men, actually. Those special 10 would be the appointed men who would consider themselves the first ever lawmakers. The earliest attempts to create a code of law was the law of 12 tables. A commission of 10 men, or also known as the Decimviri, was appointed 455 BC to draw up a code of law-binding rules on both patrician and plebeian, which would be strictly enforced. Some of these laws included simple laws like, you don't break your word. If the army or king calls on you, you gotta go. And of course, if you hit or hurt someone, you get hit or hurt back. And you owe us some money. This system was the first in its place, holding people responsible for the things that they did and said in Rome. Strategic, fundamental, and important laws like, hey, no crying at funerals, alright? You burn my corn, I'm gonna burn your corn, and I get to burn you. And yeah, no meetings at night. It's dark. Okay, so they missed their mark on a couple of them, but a couple of those laws still stuck around.
Number 9. Field surgery. The Romans were fierce on the battlefield, but they were also extremely handy. Who would have thought? This was the first time in history where quick surgeries were performed on the battlefield under the leadership of Augustus. Not Augustus Mayhew, it's a different Augustus, but he's also really helpful, like one time a year. Ancient Roman medics invented hemostatic tourniquets and surgical clamps. Yeah, guy invented clamps, imagine that on a resume. Roman field doctors would also perform physicals on new warriors. Yeah, they would also combat the spread of disease. Although they were going to war and were constantly being patched up, the Roman military would often live longer than the average folk, because these military men were constantly being disinfected. They were checking their camps all day. Masks are hard in 2020, but the Romans were disinfecting the Colosseum. Nice, we'll get there one day. Maybe.
Number 8. The name Rome. We kinda got into this a little bit about those brothers Remus and Romulus. This barbaric history is loose and from many sources, so I'm gonna kinda sum it up into broad statements. 2 brothers, didn't like each other, kept fighting, raised by a wolf and a bird. That's pretty much it. We have seen what these two have looked like. Every statue and painting of these two is always like one of them stone cold Steve Austining the other one. One built a wall and the other mocked him and jumped over that wall, and then there was only one. I feel like I made a sandcastle once and Taylor stepped on it, and I can absolutely see how the city was formed. Flawless victory. Yeah, that sounds like brotherly love to me. Rome deriving from its name Romulus, the victor in this legendary sibling quarrel, giving the city its official name. Hey, you got the god of war as your dad, and the mother of all gods and goddesses as your mom, there's gonna be some feeling of purpose just lingering around. Guess I could just make a wall. And with a couple drywall holes later, with the death and defeat of his brother Remus, Romulus claimed his position as king and named the city after himself. Selfish much? He ain't heavy, baby. He's my brother.
Number 7, the Mutinous Temple. So, we know about this tradition through some very, very angry church fathers and their many documented temper tantrums. One famous account is Christian apologist Arnibus, who angrily scribbled that the Roman matrons were taken for a ride on Tutinus with its immense shameful parts. In reality, what he's actually describing with a lot of hostility and hypocrisy as an obscene loss of purity was actually a ritual that allowed brides to have autonomy and learn not to be embarrassed by the act of intercourse and their bodies roll in it, in an era where that didn't get to happen. So stop being mad, bro, it can't always be about men. The ritual goes that before the consummation of her marriage, a Roman woman had to go through the process of deflowering herself. In order to do that, she made her way to the temple of Mutinous and the marriage deity and sat on his appendage. She didn't have to do more than a quick sit if she didn't want to. It was up to the woman. Some wanted to do the sit down, ouch, okay, time to get up and leave, got lots of wedding planning to do, while other women would, So whatever kind of woman you are, once you walked out of that temple, albeit now a little bit bow-legged, you were also now able to have proper relations with your new husband. And a deity being your first penetration would guarantee fertility and healthy children. As also mentioned previously, their society aimed for women not to have relations on the first night anyways, and rather sleep beside their husband. Unfortunately, both these practices degenerated and took women's rights with them. We've done a lot of build up to it, so let's make number 6 all about how Roman weddings have one wacky ceremony. First of all, a marriage ceremony was commonly held, although there was actually no legal requirement for such. In law, all that was required was for the bride to be led to the groom's house. The groom did not have to show up. He could quite literally be wed in absentia via a letter of intent. There's some confusion about which rituals relate to which types of marriage and from what time periods, seeing as there was 3 kinds of marriage and a lot of different eras of the Roman Empire. Purchase, which is the usual, it's always existed. Usage, super archaic, where a man and woman anyone could spend a year together unmarried, do whatever they want, and once it's hit the 1 year point, if the woman stays another 3 days, they're officially married. Then one last came into play later in the empire, and that was alongside Christianity. It had a religious character involved. In earlier times, either a lamb was sacrificed and its skin spread out for the bride to sit on, or a soul was sacrificed to Mother Earth. Either route, an auspex read the entrails to determine the fate of the couple. Then the bride unveiled herself, power move, and the couple stood face to face. In later times, when vows were introduced, she would say, "Where you are the male, I am the female," and he would respond, "Ubi tu Gaia, ego Gaius." Rings or coins were then given to the bride. A contract was signed if was desired, like a prenup agreement today. Both families could stipulate terms around children and in finances, such as a dowry. The Roman marriage ceremony, called a dextratum incutio, literally means joining of hands. The last component found in all times of the empire was a handshake that signifies the concordia, a mutual bond of affection between the married couple using their right hands. The couple then share a ritual spelt cake that the groom broke above the bride's head, not like a bottle style, in a "let me crumble this above your elaborate hairstyle to feed your head lice" kind of way. And then after the wedding comes the domum deductio, number 5. So it's a big old procession and the most important part of the wedding day, signifying a public acknowledgement of the wedding. The procession could begin at the bride's family's hearth with a ritual where she would be pulled from her mother's arms and a demonstration of the bride's modesty and sadness of leaving the family home. The entire procession then paraded to the groom's house, and the bride specifically was escorted by 3 younger men, one carrying a torch and the other 2 would be holding her arms. They are followed by the pronuba, 5 white pine torches that are carried to honor Cerces, an earth fertility goddess. The bride then has a bouquet of distaffs or spindles to nod to her duty as a wool maker for the family. Then would come the couple's friends and family behind them. Anyone else could join the procession, and many people did just for fun, all while throwing candied nuts at the bride. The groom received the bride at the door, which she entered with the distaff and spindle in hand, and at the threshold the bride adorned the doorway post with the fat of a pig to honor Cerces, the fat of a wolf to honor Rome, and then remember those raw wool strips all up in her hair? They get added to the door too. After she's finished her arts and craft project, the husband would present her the household keys. In pagan times, she'd do a consent chant, then he'd sweep her up and carry her in the doorway since tripping was a bad omen. Guests were invited in for a meal and only left when it was time to undo Hercules' knot. Like levels in a video game, now outside the bedroom door, the groom presents the bride fire and water, the elements of the household maintenance. The bride touches each, and then her husband would undo the knot, even if fortification wasn't to occur, and just like that, you're married. And you may be wondering how to congratulate the happy couple. Well, don't worry, because that's number 4 in the countdown. So, as mentioned, if you're hanging around in a procession, whether part of the wedding party or just an everyday Joe, you get to hug handfuls of dried candied fruits and nuts at the bride. Walnuts were most popular for this, which I feel would be the worst kind of nut to get stuck in your hair, but maybe getting a dried apricot thrown at you and bouncing off your cranium isn't much better either. As I'm sure you can tell, this was the cultural precursor to throwing rice, confetti, and bits of paper, which probably resulted in fewer brides with eye injuries. As an attendee, you can yell feliciter, which means good luck, or talisio, which even in the times of the late Republic was an archaic word. There were most definitely obscene songs. Naturally, they were sung by men and children in the procession. On my personal favorite, this little hand sign. This is mano fico, representing good luck, fertility, protection from the evil eye. However, in modern Italian culture, it's evolved into an intercourse-based insult, so don't go busting it out at weddings. Now here's a question I've heard a few times, and I love answering stuff. So, who can marry who is number 3. If you went back in time and asked a Roman their perspective on interracial marriage, they'd be so confused by your question they'd probably miss the fact that you're wearing Air Maxes. Fun fact, kids, but most of those ancient worlds didn't have our racial categories. A Briton and Assyrian, African and Romanian, Caribbean and Native American? What's Latin for whatever's, yo? Because they didn't regard such things as fundamentally wrong the way that modern crappy people can. The evidence seems to show that ethnicity played a little part once a group was Romanized. If they acted, dressed, and behaved as a Roman, then to most, they were a real Roman. That meant you could marry another Roman. Don't even ask me about same-sex relationships because those were laughably normal. But hear what I mentioned, Roman and Roman. That's because the big Roman taboo was class mixing. A great example is how a barbarian and a Roman citizen couldn't marry, not on the grounds of race mixing or same genders, but actually on pure legality. Marriage had to be between 2 Roman Empire citizens. Barbarians, who were anyone living in the regions around Rome but not part of the Roman Empire, did not have connubium, which is aka the right to specifically marry Roman citizens. This applied to even the Greeks, who were held above the other barbarians for being similar enough to the Romans. If a marriage between a Germanic and a Roman tried or did successfully happen, man, y'all could be beige, pink, black, green, blue, boys, girls, all in between. It's a scandal, one that could be subjected to a court case or even a death sentence. Let's talk about number 2, the Roman divorce. Prior to the late Republic, divorce was virtually unknown. Changes in marriage laws allowed for women to keep control of her dowry, and this made divorce and self-sustenance more viable option for women. And it was also simple, just so simple. Just as a marriage was only a declaration of intent to live together, as mentioned, really all that's necessary is a procession to the groom's house, divorce was just a declaration of the couple's intent not to live together. All that law required was that they declare their wish to divorce before 7 witnesses. An ex-wife could expect to receive her dowry back in full and then return to her father's possession. If she'd been independent before the wedding, i.e. orphan, freed woman, she would regain her independence. Under the Lex Julia, founded by Augustus, a wife found guilty of adultery in special court might sacrifice the return of half her dowry, and it allowed her dad to kill her, or just about any man. Really creepy. Divorce for infertility, always assumed to be the woman's fault, was valid given that bearing children was pretty much the point of the marriage thing, and also political advancement was another valid reason for divorce. In the late Republic, Cato the Younger divorced his wife Marcia so that she could marry someone else and he could forge links with the orator Quintus Hortensius, the only way he could climb in rank. Cato loved Marcia and missed her deeply, so when Hortensius dies a few years later, Cato was now a high-ranking man and remarried his now very rich ex-wife. The last and the craziest on the list is number 1. Where did it all come from? All these traditions, all these centuries. Roman weddings have had some of the most influence on traditions we still have today. Even the language, like tying the knot. But I have to come to bear some horrible, horrible origins for all of these traditions. The taking of Sabine women. The story is set when the village of Rome was first established in 753 BCE. Its population was almost entirely men, with only a small handful of already married women who are now too scared to leave their home. So, what's the answer to prehistoric evil men? Steal women of childbearing age from the neighboring township of Sabine. These girls are then forced into marriages through physicality. So when their fathers and brothers and previous husbands come to wage war and retrieve their women, the women are now mothers and throw themselves between the evil men who are now the fathers of their children and then the men who they'd been stolen from, their family. Historians say this is because women supposedly felt so much guilt over the bloodshed that started in their names and wanted to live neither fatherless nor widowed. So a truce is called, and the Sabines and the Romans unite their community. There's a lot to be said here about motives for consent, notions of honor and family, female trauma, and the history being very obviously written by a man. So, for now, let's focus on the fact that many Roman weddings refer to this legendary empire-shaping event. The hairstyle of 6 braids. It's parted with a spearhead to represent the violent capture of the Sabines, pulling the daughter from her mother's arms, and her family, taking her away in a procession to her new husband's home. Women carried across the threshold to avoid tripping, a bad omen. It's a reference to Sabine women being forcibly carried or dragged into their captors' homes. Plutarch gave more explanation to the meaning of that wedding word, thalissio, including the fact that it's named on one of the Sabine abductors and wool related, thus all the wool necessary in the wedding and the scraps being left around his front door. All of these traditions are incorporated into ancient Roman weddings after the atrocity united communities to try and ritualize the event that joined the two nations and create a bond from it, rewriting the tragedy into unity and celebration. And now, we still do some of these things today.
Number 10. Parties of poison. Hindsight is 2020. Which I find more ironic than ever since the whole thing that happened and is continuing to happen. Today we know that lead, especially in large doses, is not good. It's poison. But a lot of the pipes that the Romans used in their plumbing were made from lead. Their water had 100 times more lead in it than the water that came from the springs, which means every time they drank water, they were poisoning themselves. Some side effects include behavioral changes as well as weakening organs and vital signs, etc., which may explain some of the more questionable emperor behaviors or the fall of the Roman Empire, because people got nuts. But to add insult to injury, the Romans used to sweeten their wine with something called sappa. Sappa is lead acetate, the sugar of lead, and it's also a salt, which is confusing, and therefore poison. Since Romans could down as much as 2 liters of wine in one sitting, they were slowly poisoning themselves, first with water, then with the wine. Speaking of wine, moving on to number 9, we have You Better Love Wine. If you're a vodka or a beer person, you might not fit in while partying with the Romans, especially if you hate wine. Wine was the lifeblood of ancient Roman parties. Wine was drunk at every stage of the Roman party, but it had to be diluted with hot or cold water. Unlike how we drink wine today, which would be crazy if you were to dilute it. Whoa. It was looked down upon to drink wine in its purest form. It was served out with ladles, usually by naked and attractive male slaves. To heat the water, the Romans used special boilers, but if you really wanted to be bougie, they would add snow to make it cold. Considering they didn't have fridges back then, imagine the lengths they would have to go to keep the snow cold. Beyond temperature, Romans absolutely drooled for calda and mulsum. Calda was great for cold nights. It was kind of like a mulled wine. It was served hot and infused with spices. Mulda was infused with honey and a lot sweeter. I want to try and make both. Maybe I will on my Instagram. Let me know if I should in the comments below. Minus the lead, of course. Number 8, seating charts. If you have ever been involved in a wedding, you know how important a seating chart is. Or like even in school, when you're like assigned desks, it's a big deal. You could end up sitting next to your uncomfortable cousin or beside your smelly Aunt Sue. It could determine whether the conversation flows or it's stagnant the entire night. Ugh, hate that. Romans understood the matchmaking game when it came to banquets. It was a pretty big deal. Where you sat determined your station and overall how liked you were. They had a 3-couch system called the triclinium. The most honored guests would sit on the couch in the center next to the hosts on the right. But if you were on the couch on the left, it kinda meant that you weren't as big of a deal. Sorry. Eventually, as parties got bigger, so did the 3-couch rule extend to a huge semicircular couch in the middle that could hold about 12 people.
And speaking of bathrooms, the ancient Romans took explosive diarrhea to a whole new level with blowing up the bowl. Almost every city in ancient Rome had large public latrines, let alone any of average size or small size. In the Forum of Julius Caesar, for example, archaeologists discovered a latrine with 50 toilets. Like other latrines in ancient Rome, Caesar's had heated floors. In general, many had marble paneling, mosaics on the floor, and even decorative statues. Yet when you enter a Roman toilet, this social and cultural hub of conversation and laughter and strained faces, there was a very real risk you would die. The first problem was creatures living in the sewage system: snakes, scorpions, octopuses, and clawing rats, which would claw up and just bite or whack people on the ass while they did their business. Worse than that though, unlike today where we flush and walk away, they had to fear the methane buildup, which sometimes got so bad that it would ignite and explode under you. Sitting and doing your thing one moment turned to paste, obliterated against a stone wall the next. Toilets became so dangerous that people resorted to magic to stay alive. Written spells meant to keep toilet demons at bay were found on the walls of bathrooms. Some, though, came pre-equipped with statues of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, to guard them. And many of these good luck charms were the Ficinius. Pant snake, elusive sausage, a Jimmy, a Peter, you get my point. These bad boys, big, small, uncut, or cut, were seen everywhere. Hung in doorways, made into sun catchers or wind chimes, candles, jewelry. Just about anywhere the Romans could slap a peewee, they did it, and they believed it to ward off evil spirits and the evil eye. Obviously, they didn't share our modern skittishness towards the male member, let alone nudity. It was fairly common to see the everyday Roman man walk around with a copper dong on his necklace, seeing as they were believed to prevent harm from coming to people who wore them. Good luck peni were also drawn on safe places to keep travelers safe. Sharp curves and rickety bridges in Rome often had dongs drawn on them to grant good luck to every passerby. The volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii left it wonderfully preserved for archaeologists, who when they got their first look at it, found things that were so obscene they hid them from the public view for over 100 years. Pompeii was filled with art that was so filthy, it was like a physicalized prehistoric Brazzers.com. To this day, you can walk through Pompeii and see a sight that Romans would have enjoyed every day. Dinglings carved into the road, with the tips sometimes emitting a droplet, pointing the way to the nearest brothel. In ancient Rome, it wasn't your everyday Italian cuisine, it was more like boiled bird and brains. When one thinks of Italian food, we usually already aren't thinking correctly. Pizza was never made by them, the pasta most of us eat is totally incorrectly made, and we're drinking cappuccino wrong. But you definitely wouldn't guess things like fried dormice or flamingo, peacock, and nightingale tongues, lamb brain, sow's womb, and more. For flamingo and parrot in Foniocotero, a dish I can't pronounce, you would scald the flamingo, wash it and dress it, put it in a pot, add water, salt, dill, and a little vinegar to be parboiled. Finish cooking with a bunch of leeks and coriander and add some reduced used must to give it color. No idea what that is. In the mortar, crush pepper, cumin, coriander, laser root, mint, rue, moisten with vinegar, add date, and the fond of braised bird. Thicken, strain over, and cover the bird with the sauce and serve. Parrot is prepared in the same manner. Anything toddlers or grown North Americans would dislike from an animal was the favorite of the Romans. Many ancient Roman dishes are now famous in other countries, such as haggis, the national dish of Scotland, and foie gras, which the French have perfected. That's because the Roman Empire was vast, and when they conquered other countries, they brought snack. Fun fact, if you had dinner and were an invited guest and brought along somebody who wasn't necessarily invited, this person was called a shadow or a parasite and would sit at your foot the whole meal. They were expected to bring witty banter and conversation to help compensate for their free meal. On the topic of weird eats, how about a celebrity diet? Gladiators, godly men of battle arena who were revered in the heat and ignored in the streets. But no matter how lowly the status, something about that battler's blood was desirable. Several Roman authors report people gathering the blood of dead gladiators and selling it as medicine. Strangely, some Roman physicians actually report that this treatment worked. They claim to have seen people who drank human blood recover from their epileptic fits, and that was just the civilized approach. Others would pull out the gladiators' livers and eat them raw right there in the arena after he dropped. When gladiator combat was outlawed in 400 AD, people kept the treatment going by drinking the blood of decapitated prisoners. So while the gladiators who lost became medicine for epileptics, the winners became aphrodisiac. In Roman times, soap was hard to come by, so athletes cleaned themselves by covering their bodies in oil and scraping the dead skin cells off with a tool called strigil. I'll teach you more about that. Usually the dead skin cells were just discarded, but not if you're a gladiator. Their skin and sweat scrapings were often put in a bottle and sold. Often, this was worked into facial creams that women would then rub all over themselves, hoping the dead skin cells of a gladiator would make them irresistible to men. And there's no way I wasn't going to talk about it on its own, scraping off the layers. The grooming habits of ancient Romans were a strange mix of activities that we might recognize from our modern lives, and routines that are completely foreign to us. For example, this tool called a strigil, which resembles more of a horse's hoof pick than a human grooming tool, was used by the Romans and the Greeks of ancient world to scrape sweat and dirt from the body. People who engaged in strenuous physical activity were prone to accumulating large amounts of sweat and dirt, and were most likely to have this item in their possession. And it was most likely to be used to clean the skin before bathing, so as to not muck up the water more than necessary. Some would lather up in olive oil to help the scraping process. If you're no gladiator, that olive oil isn't going to be funneled back into a jar to sell, but rather for someone else to lather up in and use to scrape later. Public bathhouse luxury. Next up are the burial clubs, because death was an integral part of life for the Romans. Why not make a club, cult, whatever for this too, like they did for literally everything else? From the creation of Rome until about mid-2nd century AD, cremation was the most common burial rite, after which the preferred method was actual ground burials. Shockingly, having your body baked was cheaper than a fancy box in the ground, so when cremation went out of style, Rome's poorest were often tossed into pits called puticuli, meaning to rot or decompose. These pits held a mixture of human remains, animal corpses, garbage, and excrement. Some of them were large, containing 24,000 corpses each, and they'd be left open until full enough. This wasn't the best way to be buried, so anyone who could afford it would join a burial club. A burial club was a group that charged monthly dues of 100 sequestries and a jar of wine for new members. And when one of the members died, you would all pool the club's money together to bury that member. Some of these clubs had mixed membership of serfs, unfreed, and freed people. If someone took their own life, however, it was considered a forfeit right to a funeral. In addition to burying any dead members, the other main activity of the club was to hold a series of feasts every other month to honor their dead. Some of the dues were used to fund those feasts, and each one, several members, were responsible for providing a certain minimum amount of food for the sad potluck. Imagine that. Thea, I know you're still mourning Patroclus, but don't forget it's your week to bring in potluck figs and olive salad. Seriously. And of course, what completes a funeral more than a weirdly perfect replica of the dead person's face staring at you? It's death mask. The Romans celebrated the life and accomplishments of prominent men with marble busts, dedications of buildings, and grand tombs. One rather obscure crafted memorial overlooked because the artifacts have not withstood the test of time are Roman death masks, or as they're commonly commonly referred to in Latin, imagines. Made of wax, they were unquestionably created when the man was in between 35 and 40, and that's when he had attained political office or ADL of city clerk. The new mask would join the older ones in the atrium cover, where it would remain for display until that person's death. The date at which the masks were first introduced is difficult to determine, but they were already well established by the 2nd century BC, and they continued to be used into the 4th and perhaps as late as the 6th. The masks were then kept in the family throughout the generations and often displayed in the main halls of the house. At a funeral procession, the masks of the ancestors were worn by current family members as a way of preserving their memory. Polybius describes the funeral of an illustrious man and the role of his imagines. When any distinguished member of the family dies, they take the death mask to the funeral, putting them on men who seem to bear the closest resemblance to the original in stature and carriage. Penn Museum worked with 4 graduates and a career sculptor to recreate these masks, as you can see on screen. The group used only the tools and materials accessible to those in ancient Rome, and the mask came out really well. So quite literally, like the opening scene in the campy Paris 2004's House of Wax, the Romans were making wax faces.
Number 10. Roman laundry detergent. So my washing machine broke this past week, which was a pain in the neck. Worst thing about it was that it broke in the middle of a load, so I had to wash the rest by hand, which made me glad we have washing machines at all. However, the Romans were a little more simplistic with their methods of cleansing the cloth. Apparently, vessels were set out in the streets of Rome for anyone to just walk up to and relieve themselves into, and once full, they'd be taken down to the local laundromat. From there, workers would mix the vats with water and pour the combo onto their patrons' clothes, proceeding to stamp the clothes until clean? Yeah, sure, clean. Number 9. The fall of Drusses. In the case of historical poisonings, it's hard to determine whether or not they were actually poisoned or just died from being old. It's usually that they're old. But in the case of Drusses, the evidence was a little bit more clear. See, Drusses Julius Caesar was set to be the heir to Tiberius due to familial relations. His buddy Sejanus would have normally been the one to get the title, but blood is thicker than water. As a result, Sejanus tried to marry his daughter to Drus's son, but that fell through. Sejanus was still determined to become the heir to Tiberius by whatever means necessary. This led to the two infighting frequently, and Sejanus eventually managed to seduce Drus's wife, Livilla, who aided him in poisoning her husband, slowly killing him in a way that appeared to be natural, and he got away with it. Sejanus continued to rise to power until his sudden and brutal execution, which was later revealed to be due to someone leaking the truth about his rise to Tiberius. Man, this just needs to be a telenovela. Number 8. Decimation. You've likely heard the term before, used to describe the impact of some tragedy or another. However, the word actually has its roots in the Roman military, though its origin is a little different from how you might imagine. See, as I'm sure you know, the Roman military was infamous for its discipline and strategy. But if you've ever worked in any space with more than 10 people, you know it's hard to keep everyone in line. So how did the Romans do it? Simple. If one squad member screws up, the entire unit gets the punishment. Decimation roughly translates to removal of a tenth. The cohort would be divvied up into 10 groups, and each group would draw lots. The group with the shortest straws were then executed by the other 9 by whatever method was determined by their commander. The 9 of the surviving groups were then made to survive off barley, and if they had to relieve themselves, it would be outside of the camp's security. You know what? Maybe the military life just ain't for me.
Next is the emperor who essentially lived as if in a cartoon. Number 7 is Caligula's reign. Living in Rome at the same time as this guy would be a nightmare on the sole basis alone. His favorite phrase was, "Remember, I have the right to do anything to anybody," because that is what you want to hear from your leader, and he was someone who took it quite literally. This included banging his friends' wives, or the torment and subsequent killing of high-ranking senators who dared to disagree with him. He even turned killing into a sport and just attacked people at random. Caligula famously caused a famine by draining the the Roman treasury, having built vast monuments to his own greatness. After raising taxes to get some more petty cash, Caligula's spending quickly became out of control. In one famous incident, he arranged for hundreds of merchant ships to form a 3-mile-long floating bridge across the bay, which he galloped back and forth across on his horse for 2 days wearing a golden cape. Caligula wasn't like this at the beginning of his reign, when he led a series of political reforms and even recalled all the exiles from outside of Rome, but something shifted after a few months, which can be attributed to maybe a serious illness, leading Caligula to become increasingly erratic and deranged. He ordered his men to attack the beach and declared himself a god, appearing in public dressed as various gods and demigods, and he also removed the heads of gods' statues to put his own atop. He was the first Roman emperor to be killed in a coup. On to number 6, which is the crisis of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic lasted for nearly 500 years, but the crisis of the Roman Republic was nowhere near as long, rather a decades of political instability that fed social unrest from 134 to 44 BC. During this period, Rome was often at war with its neighbors while simultaneously dealing with crippling civil wars and coups as aristocrats tried to hang on to their exclusive rights and privileges against the pressure from the rest of society. So many captured people were brought into the country, it created an influx of free labor which hurt the lower classes and disrupted the agricultural system, forcing small farmers to sell their land. Wealthy people bought votes and gave favors to their friends. Bribery and corruption were rampant and led to commoners distrusting Senate, and without a police force, crime was out of control. When Rome's conquests declined, so did their sources of income. This decrease in money resulted in a loss of support for the people of Rome and created enormous stress on that economy. Officials began to tax their citizens, furthering the peasant rage. The rise of Julius Caesar as a dictator led to civil war from 49 to 45 BC and saw Roman armies fighting each other in Italy, Spain, Greece, and Egypt. This, along with economic problems, government corruption, crime, and private arms, all led to the eventual fall of the Roman Republic in 27 BCE. And since it ties in so nicely, number 5 will be the fall of Rome. After the Republic eats it, Augustus can be accredited with the establishment of the Roman Empire. He successfully curb-stomped Mark Antony during the Battle of Atticum in 31 BC, and Cleo takes herself out of commission. Augustus sets up an excellent governing system and military, bringing Rome wealth, trade, and very few military defeats. The empire reached its peak when the territory stretched from the English-Scottish border to Saudi Arabia in 117 CE, with a population high of 70 million, which was 20% of the population of the world at the time. What he can't bring Rome, however, despite all the social reforms and religious control and successful conquests, is the peace they seemingly lost. The constant civil war, financial ruin, and clan invasions had demolished the kingdom's confidence, as proven by how far the barbarian clans even made it into the Roman territories, and when the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths, it led to the final fall of the empire in 476 CE. Number 4 covers the months following Caesar's death. It's the Alaskan volcano, which we now know is to blame for the unusual weather, plagues, and famines following the death of, as said, Caesar in 44 BCE. Ancient writers who survived the period described the sun's mysterious disappearance, unseasonably cold weather, short growing seasons if not completely failed crops, and widespread famine around the Mediterranean from Rome to Egypt. Throughout the empire, starvation led to disease and fueled growing civil unrest in already turbulent times. Sources document famines in northern Italy by April of 42 BCE and northern Greece of the next year. Famines are seen in Egypt, and it's speculate that they weakened that country, making it the perfect moment for Octavian to conquer it and solidify his hold on the nascent empire. A recent study of Greenland ice cores now suggests that the volcanic culprit is Mount Okmok in what's now Alaska, half a world away from Rome, whose smoke and smog block the sun and slow spreading sulfur affect crops. Letters from Cicero, the Roman statesman whose death in 42 BC is considered the symbolic end of the Republic, mention cold weather around the time of the eruption, and the dated accounts show the slow travel of the volcano's toxins through the empire. Speaking of toxicity in Rome, let's do mass expulsions for number 3. These periods were known as the drastic points in ancient Roman history. Romans didn't really care for race or sexuality as long as you dressed, talked, and behaved like a Roman. That's all that was needed to be respected in their society, immigrant or otherwise. But without holding a Latin status, immigrants had very little protection. As a result, multiple times in Roman history, nobles and emperors alike decided to kick folks out, and for a variety of reasons. You're a lawyer, doctor, or a construction worker, doesn't matter how helpful you are out. Don't have a homeland to return to? Doesn't matter. Naturally, thousands would starve just outside the kingdom's gates for that reason. However, a mass expulsion could calm angry Roman citizens looking looking for someone to blame during a famine, war, or plague, generally something or anything that would cause shortages. Religions such as Judaism or Roman paganism was often a target for expulsion, as seen in 98 BCE and 177 BCE. Professions could also be targeted. Cicero writes of an expulsion of philosophers in 126 BCE. It may not be right, of course, for one who is not a citizen to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the law on this point was secured by two of our wisest consuls. Still, to prevent foreigners from enjoying the advances of the city is altogether contrary to the laws of humanity. In a time of famine, Suetonius talks of how Augustus expelled owned people and gladiators. Once indeed a time of great scarcity, when it was difficult to find remedy, Augustus expelled from the city the laborers that were for sale, as well as the schools of gladiators, all foreigners with the exception of physicians and teachers and a part of the household servants. And what better to follow up expulsion than something that caused one? Number 2 is the plague of 165 AD, whose victims would fall to fever and chills with diarrhea starting red that turned black within a week. During that time, black pockmarks would scab their bodies to peel off and leave deep-ditched wounds. Towards the end, people would even cough up or excrete scabs that had formed inside of them. Like some beast, a contemporary wrote, the sickness destroyed not just a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them. Victims would suffer for 2, sometimes 3 weeks before dying or recovering by minor miracle. This was smallpox in its first form. The Romans had dealt with malaria, intestinal wasting diseases, and worms living in putrefying wounds that would refuse to heal. But smallpox was something that began as a terrifying rumor from the east, spreading through conversation that simultaneously transmitted news of the disease and the virus itself. The smallpox plague remained in Rome for a generation, finding a peak in the year 189 when it was taking as many 2,000 people per day. It decimated the aristocracy to such a degree that town councils couldn't meet, local magistrates went unfulfilled, and community organizations failed. Abandoned farms and depopulated towns dotted the countrysides from Egypt to Germany. Alrighty, last but never the least on the list, number 1 is horrific banquets. Roman history written between 211 and 233 by Diocast describes a hellish meal hosted by Emperor Domitian in the year 89. It was an event seemingly designed to torment its participants. The room was completely black, from the floor to the ceiling to the table. The guests, most of whom were senators, were each assigned a personalized gravestone seat. The food served was traditionally offered as sacrifices to departed spirits, and it was all also colored to be black. Every single one of the guests feared and trembled and was kept in constant expectation of having his throat cut at the next moment, writes Cassius. Domitian apparently relished in their terror, conversing only upon topics relating to death and demise. Whether or not this dinner actually happened, it falls into a subsection of very real dinner entertainment from the past, categorized by the late historian Phyllis Bye Barbie as black or hell banquets, were designed to evoke funeral services at the least or afflictions of hell itself at the worst. One famous Roman account was in March of 1519, Lorenzo di Filippo Strozzi's home. It said that a few flickering candles revealed skulls, skeletons. According to one account, no one wanted to eat because it was such a terrifying scene, and when his guests couldn't take any more, apparently at least 2 cardinals vomited that day, Strozzi orchestrated the grand finale, cracking open the skull and bones to reveal they were fakes made of sugar and filled with roast pheasant and sausages.
Number 10. Sacred books. The Romans paved the way for many following civilizations, okay? They invented surgical tools, they invented medicine on the battlefield, and before this era, literature took the form of a tablet or a scroll. The Romans, they created the codex. Pages stacked on top of one another, just bound pages. The reason you have homework right now to be doing instead of watching this. It's all thanks to the ancient Romans. The early codex was bound wax, and then it moved to animal skin. This was a big step because early Christians used this new invention to produce copies of the Bible. Important pieces of history, so rightfully so, they had to be locked away from the public. Now back when King Tarquin ruled Rome, a local woman offered the Etruscan king 9 books. Now these books were ignored at first, but upon its second glance, the beat up manuscripts foretold the rise and fall of Rome. So for most of its time, these spoiler-filled manuscripts were held in the Temple of Jupiter. So if anybody wants to do National Treasure 3, I have some ideas, just saying. We could do like 9 installments. Number 9, corrupt fire department. Oh, here we go. When we think back to ancient times, it's not long before we come across an ancient blaze or some ancient wild tragedy where you're like, oh my god, how did that even happen? Something that reminds you that it wasn't always a party, okay? It was rarely a party, in fact. When we think of Julius Caesar when regarding the leadership of Rome, we often forget Marcus Crassus. He was powerful and full of bright ideas on the sidelines. Marcus ran the fire brigade. A lot of open fires, a lot of accidents happened happening at this time, so of course we need responders. But back then, these officials arrived on site to this blazing emergency, but before helping out, Crossus would demand the owner sells their property to him first. Yeah, watch it burn or sell it for a not so handsome price. The choice is yours. And also you have 38 seconds to decide. TikTok. Number 8, ancient drag. I'll respect a girl's night out, okay? Always. I get it. My guy friends have ruined most nights out that I've had in the city, because guys are dumbasses. That's a fact. Ancient Romans were ahead of the game with this one as well. That's why they made the festival of the good goddess women only. Yeah, statues of men weren't even allowed to partake. Statues depicting men at this festival had to be draped. Yeah, none of us were seeing anything. But then in comes Mr. Jealous, Mr. Ancient FOMO himself. Enter Publius Clodius Pulcher, okay? This man disguised himself as a flute lady, but when he didn't play the flute, and also wasn't a lady, and also nobody knew him, it was a little obvious that an intruder was present. A trial soon followed and the festival was then suspended. See, guys ruin the party, even in ancient Roman days. This dude's like, nah, I'm gonna go ruin it.
Stolen or not, once you're married, it's time for number 7, the Darkened Threshold. The practice of the groom carrying the bride across the threshold of their new home or bedroom doorway dates back to the forcible actions taken on the Sabines as they fought tooth and nail to escape the soldiers. When it evolved and became part of a reenactment, the brides would continue to be carried through the threshold, but with a lot more steps in the process. So after that long and dramatic reenactment procession I mentioned, and the guests and the groom whipping walnuts at her the whole time to represent leaving childish things behind, since nuts, which was its name, was a child's game in ancient Rome. The bride would then be put down outside the front door. She would oil the door's hinges with melted tallow, wolf fat, or olive oil to keep out sorcery. Then she would hang some woolen strips taken out of her elaborate hairstyle on the door as a symbol of her taking over the traditional wives' duty of weaving wool, but also to represent the scraps of material torn off of the Sabines. To go inside her new home, the groomsmen would then lift the bride over the threshold and into the house's atrium. The threshold was sacred to the goddess Vesta, so Romans believed that carrying the woman across the threshold would ensure she avoid tripping, a bad omen. This, however, is also a reference to the Sabine women being carried inside of captors' homes. Number 6, we move away from the Sabine reenactment specific traditions. It's now cuffed up. So fun fact, it was under Romans that the detailed legal requirements for engagements, weddings, and divorce were first instituted. Given that marriage in ancient Rome was something that required strict adherence to law, it may not be surprising that it was also regarded as a contract, thus a ring was necessary. Women in ancient Rome society were given 2 wedding rings, an iron one and a gold one. The iron was stylized in the early times of Rome to look like or even act as a functioning key, indicating their husbands owned them and they were a homemaker. This ring was worn at home, whilst the second was worn in public to impress people. The most common type of ring associated with Roman marriages was the fede ring, which has a design showing a pair of clasped hands or an entwined couple. Less charming is how they're representative of a contract that's comparable to a farmer buying cows. The ring would act as a receipt and passing of ownership between the father to the future husband. That's why only women wore rings, because men weren't property. Going hand in hand with that last point is number 5, dowry on a finger. You know that whole selfish notion that if they really love you, they'll spend a fortune on a ring because that's what you're worth? Guess where that comes from? Creepy, right? Nowadays, it can be obvious from a ring how much someone paid for it, but back in ancient Rome, looking at a ring was how you established how much a woman was worth. And you could base how much you should respect her on that. Cheap ring, that means a small dowry and an unworthy woman. Yikes. In fact, author Karen K. Hirsch notes that rings were often used for this purpose in regular business transactions in Rome, making it very possible they entered the wedding ceremony with that mindset around the 15th or 16th century. The groom would offer a ring as a sign of his serious intention, offering up some collateral that the bride could keep if he decided to back out of the engagement. Rings were sometimes used as a deposit on the expected dowry or as a simple payment to the bride as part of her acquisition. For number 4, if you got some bad luck, bouquet it. So, having a pantheon of multiple gods is going to create some strong superstitions. Gods were jealous and had to be pacified with gifts and praise so that they would behave and grant wishes. Sometimes these gifts took the form of a handful of wheat or garlands and fragrant herbs. The origin of the bridal bouquet stems back to ancient Rome when bridal couples would weave greenery and blossoms into garlands and crowns scented with roses or orange blossoms, adding herbs to honor the gods and promote fertility and good fortune, says Valerie Gittleman. Strands of ivory illustrated the strong bond matrimony and fidelity, while white blossoms symbolize sweetness and happiness. Sheaves of wheat, for example, symbolize plenty and good harvests, i.e. fertility, which alongside faithfulness were the topmost virtues of ancient marriage. These garlands would be found on the altar spaces on the groom's head, wound into the intricate six-vestal bridal hairstyle, and naturally in the cluster the bride carries, all meant to ward off evil spirits that might try to harm her. Speaking of hair and bridal beauty, how about the Roman candle for number 3? I talked about the flammeum in the last video about Roman marriage, but more so about what it represents and its purposes. As you may know, had you seen it, the flammeum is a oak yellow color. However, it didn't start this way, rather as a vibrant orange-red color designed to look like fire so it would scare off evil spirits. Also, it does explain the name flammeum to you. This flammeum also covered the bride's entire body in a 360 style, and originally they were weighed down with like heavy leaf garlands, precious stones, real rocks if you're broke. This was to prevent her, or at least try to slow her down if she was to try and run away. Why the change to yellow? Sun fading on veils passed down through the centuries. The concern for evil spirits lessened. People liked the color mustard yellow. I don't know, take your pick. What stayed the same was having to use a billion pins to keep the damn thing on. Thankfully, the 6-braid Vestal Virgin hairstyle was conducive to that, but it was also conducive to hiding weapons. Circling us back to the Sabine and captured bride concept. Before a bride was allowed into the marriage bed, it became code that all jewelry that could be used as a weapon by the bride would have to be removed, including hairpins, bracelets, rings, and necklaces. Turns out some smart ladies kept some blades between their veil and scalp to protect themselves from their unwanted husbands once behind closed doors. I'm sure their Sabine ancestors would have been proud of them. This one's a little odd, but you may now kiss the priest, in at number 2. Pre-Christianity, kissing in Rome was actually a greeting. Before you picture a hot and sloppy makeout sesh, that's not the case. I mean a peck or little brushy brush of the lips. It was done between strangers, nobility, and family. Hell, they had to put laws in place to get people to stop laying them on each other when pandemics would break out so less people would die. It wasn't a romantic thing in the slightest, common for friends to kiss one another's closed eyelids, necks, and mouths, and considered a great privilege to greet members of your own family with a kiss. This rule was not to be broken or followed incorrectly. As Christianity took root in ancient Rome, the act of kissing became shamed alongside nudity, intercourse, and just about anything that was natural. What did remain was the kiss of peace. These were initially acceptable between men and women, but over time, Rome went from a kiss-friendly to no-tongue action township. Because God forbid you kiss someone thanks for the loaf of bread you bought and feel a tingle somewhere. I know you bought bread from her every day for the last 13 years before now and kissed her thanks every time, but you never know. Today could be the day you defy God and embrace the devil. Tisk tisk, Romans. Anyways, jokes aside, despite the casual greeting kiss and the romantic kisses before marriage being banned, the kiss of peace remained, and one of the times that kiss happened was at the marriage ceremony, where the priest would turn to the groom and absolutely lay one on the guy. After that, the groom has to turn to the bride and give her some sloppy tongue action next. Idea was that the priest passed a blessing through his mouth to the grooms and the groom would pass it to the bride. Thus why the groom can kiss the bride and not the other way around. And last but not least, it's everyone's favorite gals, the bridesmaids, number 1. Bridesmaids are as much a sight to behold as the bride herself, mostly because back in the day, they dress almost exactly the same as the bride. Complete opposite of the downright offensive thing some of y'all have your best friends wear. Girl, if you love her, you wouldn't make her wear that shade of pink that she can't. Anyways, the Romans believed that the bride, being so pretty, is easy prey for vengeful spirits that would harm her. Thus, the bouquets, the flammeum, and now the bridesmaids, aka decoy brides. These maidens' purposes were literally to confuse evil spirits. They would dress identical to each other in an outfit somewhat similar to the bride's own. Since the bridesmaids would be surrounding the bride and look so similar to one another, it was believed the evil spirits would become confused and fly off somewhere else. Reader's Digest also noted the use of bridesmaids in a similar fashion to the best man, confusing rival lovers or even criminals seeking to take the bride. As a result, the tradition of bridesmaids wearing identical dresses to the bride persisted until the 1880s. Of course, modern bridesmaids who consider the role less of an honor than a job with the terrible uniform should consider something else noted by Reader's Digest. In ancient times, bridesmaids were literally the bride's maids. At least these days, you're getting drunk on a yacht with her. First up at number 10, let's talk about the horrid Roman wedding colors. I mean, they have you out here looking like a McBride. I'm talking Happy Meal. Whoever had decided that egg yolk yellow must have been the move, must have hated Romans or women or both. So, to paint y'all a picture, the night before her wedding, having given away her childhood dolls, a Roman girl might sleep in a tunca recca, a special white woolen robe she has to woven herself to demonstrate her domestic skills. If you, let's say, sucked at domestic skills, you'd essentially be wearing like a pillowcase with no arms type of thing. So, on the morning of the wedding day, the bride is dressed by her mother, and everything she wore has to be cream or a yellow wool. It's the only material harvested from an animal while it's still alive, thus it contained animus, aka spirit. This must seem an absolutely brazenly stupid material choice given the Mediterranean climate, but keep in mind it was spun to be supremely Aryan light. That doesn't make it any less chafy though, so. On to the egg yolk, aka flammium, the flame-colored or color of egg yolk veil used to cover the bride's hair and shielded her face. It signaled the transition into a matron's pala, a huge rectangular shawl worn by wedded women. But before you slap that rain poncho on her head, don't forget to do the elaborate Sunny Creens hairstyle. What's that mean in English? Intercourse creens. It's 6 special braids wound with a bunch of fragrant herbs to do with fertility, but also covers the fact people were smelly. Don't worry, you add more cotton this time to her hair in colorful strips. Last but not least, like your daughter is a present under the tree, you tie her up in a bow. More accurately, a cingulum. It's a wool belt tied with something called a Hercules knot that her husband has to be competent enough to undo on the wedding night. Toss on a pair of neon yellow slippers and you're ready to go down the aisle looking like a crumpled napkin covered in mustard. Let's go. So, marriage required giving up a lot of yourself, including your girlhood. Number 9 is Bye Barbie. As we all know, girls were married off while still young, but to give you like the smallest semblance of peace, many Roman emperors upheld and enforced that consummation wasn't allowed despite a marriage occurring until a woman reached a certain age, just to ensure they didn't die unnecessarily, and childbirth was a major 50-50 back then. Some women were genuinely barred from giving birth well into their 20s if their family had a bad rep of lady deaths. But the night before a wedding, no matter what happened once the knot was tied, pun intended, and no matter her age, a girl set aside dolls, old hairbrushes, and dresses and donned in matronly garb for the first time and ceremoniously burnt her old items. By dedicating her toys and youthful possessions to the household gods, it became a transition in which she would emerge a woman. Even if you're like 20, you had to do this. I'm sure it didn't have to go as far as burning it, like sheesh, maybe save them for when you have a kid of your own, that way you don't have to remake and rebuy all this stuff again. Or find like a prehistoric value village to donate to, maybe. And while we're giving things away, why don't you take a second and scroll on down to the red button below so you can subscribe to the Hive. Now, as mentioned, Roman emperors had some more really than a little say in marriage. So, number 8 is all about how it was governed by law. There were very specific laws governing marriage, and these laws evolved depending on the era, the emperor in control, and then when Christianity entered the empire. Pretty consistently, a proper Roman marriage could not take place unless the bride and the groom were Roman citizens or had been granted special permission called a connubium. So, more on the laws around that in a later point. At one time in Roman history, those who had been owned people, now freed, were forbidden to marry citizens. This restriction was relaxed by an Emperor Augustus who passed a reform in 18 BC called the Lex Julius, so that, by the 1st century, freed peoples were only prohibited from marrying senators. Augustus instead insisted on other restrictions on marriage. Citizens weren't allowed to marry working girls or actresses, and provincial officials were not allowed to marry local women. Soldiers were only allowed to marry in certain circumstances, and marriages to close relatives were forbidden. Finally, unfaithful wives divorced by their husbands could not remarry. In the Republic, there was a stipulation that if the bride is, not deflowered, her husband should only sleep beside her for at least one night without engaging in physical touch. The aim of that was to give women a chance to get used to a new situation. Another thing meant to help her get used to a new situation.
Number 7, the 9th Legion. In ancient Rome, there was a legion that was known to be the best of the best the Romans had to offer. It was known as the 9th Legion. Being the best of the best came with being put into the harshest of areas to fix Rome's problems. So these boys in red were sent to England past Hadrian's Wall, where they would fight against the Picts. But then, they were just never heard from again, ever. Now, the obvious answer here is that they got absolutely demolished by the Picts. The last thing we heard was from the year 108, and we know that the Legion had a pretty brutal surprise attack in Caledonia due to some Roman guards falling asleep on the job, which doesn't really seem like best of the best behavior now, does it? What makes this whole thing really weird is that in 121, there are some bricks that have the seal of the 9th Legion on them, which is about 13 years after their last mention. And on top of that, there is an officer from that legion who shows up as the governor of Arabia in 142. I think these could have just been survivors who were taken out of England after the best of the best went bust. But who knows? Not me. Number 6. Locusta the Poisoner. Nero, you little rascal you. Emperor Nero was known as one of the worst, and he was also known for having a few people, de-lifed. What better way to do that than with poison? The chemist Locusta was the one who became his poison expert, but she's also kind of unfairly known as the world's first serial de-lifer because of that. Kind of unfairly because it could be completely true. We just have no idea. We know from historians at the time that Nero and even his mother liked Locusta so much that he actually helped set her up with a school dedicated to creating new poisons and all kinds of research surrounding poison. But we don't actually have any of that research. There is no proof of any of it. But she was executed by the guy who took on Nero's job after he was gone, and I can't help but think there is a decent reason for that. Maybe because of all the people she poisoned and helped poison? We will never know. Probably. I mean, we could. I don't know. Number 5. Play that lyre to the fire. While we're talking about Nero, he actually has a mystery all of his own. Nero was very famously a fan of music. He would often sing and play instruments, and he was also a fan of being utterly insane. Ending lives and forcing people to party all night, have massive parties, and eat until they puked. So when you hear a rumor that this crazy emperor may have caused the Great Fire of Rome that destroyed a lot of the city on July 18th in the year 64, you might believe it. And you might even believe the rumor that he also played the lyre while the city burned. It just kind of all checks out for how crazy he is, but obviously we have no evidence of that actually happening. Neither of those two rumors can be proven, especially not now, 1,958 years later. What we do know is that the emperor did benefit quite a bit from the destruction the fire caused. It allowed him to change the aesthetics of the city, persecute thousands of Christians, and introduce new building codes. It also turns out Nero may have been 35 miles away in Antium, but I mean, prove it! You can't. I can't. Number 4. Ham Hill. Ham Hill in England is the location of an archaeological dig by the universities of Cambridge and Cardiff, where we made the crazy discovery of the graves of a lot of people, dating back to the time in history when Romans made their way into England. The part that is so alarming, other than finding a pile of corpses, is that these particular bodies had been stripped of their exterior layers and chopped up. It's gruesome. But oddly, most of the skeletons found here actually belonged to women, and most of which were women in their early 20s. But this wouldn't be a mystery if those were all the facts. We actually don't know what happened here. The obvious answer is some kind of mass life-ending escapade, but why, damn it, why? We don't know. Number 3. Hard Talker. Surprise! You've met the afterlife. Were you a good person? Well, if you weren't, if you were a threat to your community, say in ancient Rome, then it's pretty likely you would have been buried face down. So there, take that. Hold up, they cut out your tongue and put a stone in your mouth? What in the Gaius Octavius Caesarian, what is going on here? That's probably what the team who unearthed the grave of a man from a Northamptonshire site dating back to Roman Britain probably said. They found a man who was buried face down in his grave, missing his tongue with a stone in its place. Pretty odd. Infection in the bones of his jaw show it was removed while he was still alive. And the practice of replacing a missing body part with another object was definitely known to happen in Roman Britain, although it was rather rare. The only thing is we have absolutely no idea what this man had done. Maybe he just really talked too much. Maybe he lost his tongue to something completely unrelated to his delifing, and this stone was just to replace it. We don't actually know, and there is no evidence to tell us. Theories? Number 2. Skulls of London. I'm not really sure how this happens, how it was discovered, or anything, but in 1988, 39 skulls were excavated really close to the Museum of London in London. Those 39 skulls were alarming enough, but the 39 soon expanded into hundreds of skulls. Now, possible theories included that the skulls belonged to executed criminals, gladiators, or even soldiers that had done the Monty Python, run away! Most of the skulls seem to have been from men, and most indicated that they suffered rather brutal offings. Some people think the skulls were dumped in display pits. Some people think they were placed there purposely. To make matters worse, not too far away we also discovered what seems to be an ancient Roman cooking pot with bits of humans in it. All of this creepy stuff was found in an area no bigger than a swimming pool, which makes it very obvious that it was all a part of the same thing. Possibly part of some crazy Roman cult. Maybe it's all just a big coincidence. We don't have the evidence to know. I don't think I could really tell you exactly what in the name of Mark Antony went on here, but I do know that it were not good. Number 1. Mole warfare. Who would have thought chemical warfare would make for a great story? Especially 2,000-year-old ancient chemical warfare. Back in the Roman city of Dura Europus in Syria, a siege took place between the Roman and the Persian forces. During said battle, the Persians dug siege tunnels underneath the walls of the Roman city. The Romans knew and built their own tunnels to cut them off. Problem with tunnels like that is you have absolutely no idea of where exactly the opposing team is going to show up. The Romans ended up building their tunnel higher than the Persians did, so you got like this kind of situation going on. Now, archaeological digs have discovered about 19 Roman soldiers in these tunnels. But it seems that these soldiers were not stabbed to cause their demise, but instead, they seem to have suffocated. Well, how the heck did that happen? According to archaeologist Simon James, he believes that the Persians actually allowed the Romans to dig into their tunnel, and then use the elevated position with a sort of chimney effect to set a mix of bitumen and sulfur on fire and let the fumes do the deed. But, and say it with me, there is absolutely no evidence of this. Yes, good, you've caught on. Very nice.
Number 10 is the annual exorcism that renders the whole month of May unlucky for marriages, hence the proverb, bad girls wed in May, aka Lemuralia, a whole private behind closed doors holiday dedicated to kicking ghosts out of your house. It dates back to hella pagan times, the 6th century BCE, and only seemed to tamper out around the 3rd. Held only on the lucky dates of May 9th, 11th, and 13th, philosopher Ovid tells us in his writings Fasti that Romulus began this tradition to appease the restless and angry spirit, otherwise called lemures in Roman times, of his brother whom he'd killed. The head of the household was responsible for getting up at night, washing his hands in spring water, and walking through the home with his hands like this. He would either take a mouthful or handful of black beans and then spit them or throw them over his shoulder to the hungry spirits, repeating the following incantation 9 times. I send these with these beans, I redeem me and mine. While dad is doing that, give your kids some pots and pans and tell them to reenact Stomp. The household member's role is to clash bronze pots while repeating, ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone. The householder washes his hands in spring water 3 times, rinse and repeat for 3 days, pun intended. The Lemuralia was meant to help those family members who had died in circumstances that prevented or delayed their admission to the afterlife. This could be dying before your time, or through sudden disease, war, misadventure, or a circumstance that would prevent a proper burial. On the 3rd day, they lightened the energy a little. A merchant's festival and fair was held to ensure a prosperous year for business. Number 9 is how Rome couldn't handle when badass Carthaginian general came a-knockin'. It's the Hannibal invasion. The Carthaginians had lost Rome in the First Punic War, and that was no picnic for anyone involved. The fragile truce called between the nations of Rome and Carthage was tenuous, and Rome was taking more and more control over the Mediterranean Sea by the day, which both economies heavily depended on. Just like in a movie, from the shadows of the concerned Carthaginians came Hannibal, the hot new young general on the scene and the son of Hamilcar, one of the best Carthaginian generals. Now, in the wake of his father's death, with the Roman rage train rolling and something to prove, Hannibal forms his own plan, one that became known as one of the most significant historical events of ancient Rome. They would come to Italy and descend from the Alps. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal led one of the biggest military journeys in history, and what would follow was a series of increasingly catastrophic disasters for the Roman Senate. The first major pitched battle at the river Trebia in December of 218 saw over half the deployed Roman forces eradicated. The Roman consul Flaminius overreacts and pursues Hannibal's army into the hills of Lake Trasimene in June of 217, where they're ambushed and a total of 15,000 Romans are killed. Now, a consul is dead and a significant portion of the army is gone. Instead of recollecting calmly, Rome continues to panic, and the newly elected consuls are given 20,000 Roman men each, as well as 40,000 supplementary troops from Roman allies, stocking an army of around 80,000 men. Imagine being a civilian right now, just everyone is being called for draft half men every day, they leave en masse, never return. It's with these forces that the consuls confronted Hannibal at the Roman supply base Cannae, where he had taken. But they did it without taking into account the flat terrain, heavily favored the Carthaginian cavalry. Lo and behold, it's a downright killing spree, and out of the 80,000 men who fought, only 14,500 Romans escaped death or captivity. Let's talk about some more Roman political fumbles. In number 8, the year of 4 emperors. Nero, the emperor who started his reign fabulously only to end it universally despised, was the first emperor to definitively take their own life. He did this with a lot of pomp and flair, but also without leaving an heir. This set up an immense power grab into motion, leading to the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD. So let's do a credit run for these guys, shall we? Galba, who follows Nero, pretty much killed every distinguished man without a trial for petty differences. But then, when the people of Rome called upon him to punish 2 corrupt legions, he gave them honors and promotions. He also allowed his friends to wield taxation and condemnation as political favors. He gets killed by his own guards and his body laid in the street until a common soldier sought its head and delivered it to Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho, now elected emperor, immediately has Vitellius on it, refusing all offers of peace settlements and demanding a battle. Otho loses 40,000 men to him, and the man who tells him this takes his life at Otho's feet. Otho couldn't tough it, so he said goodbye to his loved ones, dispersed his wealth, took his own life. The Senate immediately hands Vitellius the throne to spare themselves more battle. Was a gluttonous dirtbag. Disregarding democracy, he mimicked Nero in setting himself up to be the supreme power. He held his position for 8 months before the founder of the Flavian dynasty, Titus Flavius, suddenly had the legions of Syria, Alexandria, Moesia, Pannonia, Illyricum declaring him the emperor, and the terrified Vitellius disguises himself with rags and tries to escape the city, but fails.
Number 7, party hard. The term boot and rally was added to the Urban Dictionary back in 2002, pretty recent, but Romans, they were doing that a long time ago. They were riding that wave out a long time ago. They were ahead of the game. They knew how to get down. All those ancient parties, well, rather, they knew how to get it back up. Ancient Romans would often make themselves throw up in order to continue eating and drinking because it was a social status. Yeah, what would normally be a red flag at a house party was a sign of respect back then. But it was business. These parties were literally business meetings. These long, exhausting banquets, attending these was a sign of social standing. So you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most. You wanted to dance the most. And you wanted to, ideally, puke the most. Those are the coolest Romans in town, right? You ever see a Roman gagging? You know, he's getting some stuff done in the city. He's like, oh, excuse me. The solution back then was to throw it up and then continue. So you can, excuse yourself from dinner, go to the vomitorium, right across from the dining room. How convenient. Must be a nice breeze rolling through there, I'm sure. But then you would go to this room, grab a feather, and then tickle, thy throat, and then make room for even more lobster. Yeah, they have a thing that holds feathers. So you just go in and go, oh, a blue one. And then you shove it down your mouth, and then put it back in. After you dry it off first, you gotta put it back in. Number 6, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out, okay? Those 1 a.m. selfies have to look good. That's the whole point, or else why are we going out? Why am I putting on shoes, right? The curls aren't working, I'm not going outside, that's it. In ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was common. They didn't have any neon lights or anything cool. They didn't have Arctic monkeys playing or any cool atmospheres. It was just a lot of bricks. And also, it of course smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle either. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, they also, same with the feathers, they had to share said sticks. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal, it was business, you would spend hours here and you got stuff done. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, you name it. All the while there's a dude in the corner just taking a shit. Romans believed the goddess Glaucina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Glauca Maxima translates to big drain. So when you invent the flushing toilet, yeah, you're like, this is some higher power. You can call your toilets whatever you want, Just maybe don't call any more meetings there because it smells a little bad. Number 5, no soap. Look, sometimes you're in a rush, you don't have time to shower, so you do the classic Axe body spray X, The old 1-2. Do you remember that, Chris? Oh, yeah. It was so cold too on the armpits. Yeah, no wonder I can't grow armpit hair. I've been spraying like aerosol, I've been spraying spray paint on my armpits every morning since I was like 9. I still use it sometimes. Axe chocolate? No contest, so good. Ancient Romans, they were way ahead of the game. They didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent like I mentioned earlier. It's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. No, instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz. But later on, once said oil had dried up, They then removed it with a wooden wedge or spatula, a tool called a strigil, and they just peel it off. I kind of like that idea. Whenever I burn in the summer, I'm like, ooh, let me peel this neck slowly. It's the world's most painful loofah, essentially. Dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently peeled off. So it worked, but it took a little more time than our showers nowadays. For Romans who were well off, this of course was a whole event. There were several, assistants. You could pick all these fancy fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. It was like fun, dare I say. How was anybody ever on time? Like, oh, sorry, I was late. Those oil baths had to stick around for 4 hours this morning and get peeled. It's crazy. Number 4, Roman art. This one reminds me of Superbad a lot, and you'll understand why. Back in the 18th century, when excavations took place in the city of Pompeii, they found lots and lots of art, all with a similar theme. Everything looked like a certain body part. An eggplant-ish theme. There were carvings in the streets, there were carvings of these things in the walls, under a street sign, you name it. They're just everywhere. Just rich history carved in all over. We're still finding these today. They're called the phalluses of Pompeii. Yeah, imagine tripping over one of these. Then you do that thing where you look back to see what you almost rolled your ankle on. You look back and see that, you're like, oh, what? Some dude in Pompeii got you like thousands of years ago. Just chiseling out a... Many tour guides like to say that they all point and lead to a brothel, when in reality, that's a lie. These were all just for good luck. These symbols were to ward off the evil eye. Most folks kept these outside the front of their homes, right next to the mailbox. Coming with mail, you're like... Number 3, animals in the Colosseum. In order to spice up the classic fight and clash swords till someone's not alive anymore, sometimes gladiators would be put in the arena with an animal instead of another human being to, spice it up, just to spice up those Saturday night shows, I guess. People are crazy. Were they squirrels? Or were they tigers, elephants, bears, leopards, lions, hyenas, or wolves? The latter. It was all the scary big animals. Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used every day, but the organizers of these battles would go all out for the fights that did include them. Everyone would pile in. It's kind of like Logan Paul versus Mayweather, these big social events. We're like, well, what else are we doing, let's go watch. Most animals that were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part. I'm a big animal lover, so that's hard to read. This led to other important factors down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals took place. That's where it all started. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile, for example, and then made them extinct. That's how they did that. Cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct more and more. Let's just bring gladiators back. Let's just do it. UFC, put them in armor. Let's just see what happens. That'd be hilarious. Release all the animals from zoos and then bring back just gladiators. Life will be fixed. Number 2, naval battles. Have you ever heard about staged naval battles in the Colosseum? It's a weird spectacle, but it wouldn't have been that crazy. It sounds a lot bigger and more lavish than it really was. The Colosseum was flooded at this point, which I'm sure took a hot minute, and then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times almost, but with a splash zone. A really dirty splash zone. These ships were designed to resemble vessels from famous battles before, but the bottom of the ship was flat, right? These were fake boats, obviously. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use, real ships or anything like that. It was all show. It wasn't always violent reenactments either though, as funny as that sounds when you think of the Roman Colosseum. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and have nude, synchronized swimmers as a show. Imagine that, imagine traveling the land and then you get there, you're like, oh, let's watch some action, and it's just like ballet, and they're like, oh, this is actually quite nice, I like this a lot. Yeah, also goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so they had to swim underwater like, ugh, this is so gross, their poor eyes. These naval stories were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them now. Like the Goblet of Fire, people would walk to a lake to watch these insane shows. Only once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the Colosseum's old floodgates to hide those animals in. So it was, we love upgrades, I guess. It sucks, it's all bad. And finally, number 1, audience troubles. Okay, what's it like watching these ancient Colosseum shows? Was it fun? Was it horrifying to watch? Were you... Like, the PTSD from these shows alone. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat would pour in often. The energy is high. This was their only entertainment. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 3, you know what I mean? Some fans would get so into the action that they, of course, would heckle, like we do nowadays with like UFC. People would be watching like, oh, throw the right hook, throw this thing. They would obviously do the same. But in Roman Colosseum days, you didn't get a warning if you heckled, you know what I mean? One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, who I mentioned earlier, he was pretty diehard about the Colosseum and their games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd was heckling a gladiator so much, he was probably, talking smack about his oiled up abs or something like that. So Emperor Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena. And then he had to fight to survive. He didn't get out alive, obviously. It was all bad. So yeah, don't huckle. Don't huckle? Don't huckle or heckle. Don't huckle or heckle or heckle. How terrifying is that? Can you imagine heckling and then getting called out? Ancient Colosseum times. Hey Maximus, smile. Me?
Number 10, stuffed dormice. This list is going to be kinda tough even for a meat eater like me. Dormice are small rodent animals found in the old world like Europe and Africa and Asia. The old world, you get it. But just as common as your American house mouse. As it turns out, they were a favorite of Roman cuisine. Oh god, the horror. Sometimes they were even fattened up for a better meal. The recipe goes as follows, because I just know the folks at home are salivating at the mouth wanting to try this. Get your farm fresh dormouse, empty its cavity, and stuff it with an assortment of other meats and spices. Oh, beautiful, magnifique, and sometimes dipped in honey. Like stuffed jalapenos, except they're from hell. Mice are also known for not being the cleanest animals on earth, so I'm gonna hard pass on this one, brother. No thanks. Number 9, sea urchins. Until today, I had never seen what the inside of a sea urchin looked like. I just never did. That's when our most handsome boy Adam said, let me show you. Weird creatures, or at least to my North American palate they are. Very strange looking. Plus, when they were opening those bad boys up, it just looked like it was too much effort for a little bit of orange looking meat. Strange. Well, Romans, being geographically located in the Mediterranean Sea, found themselves around a lot of these bad boys and started to crack them open. I saw a technique with 2 spoons, but well, I feel like a couple good bashes from a Roman sword ought to do the trick. All the things in this list, this is probably the least gross. Although, I gotta say, you see a spiky thing in the water like that, and the first guy was like, we should eat this. It's so weird. Why would you do this? It doesn't look edible. Number 8, flamingo tongue. Excuse me? I said, looking very cute at the computer researching this topic. Curb your tongue, internet, I said. I do not believe you. Alas, as cute and as blue and innocent as my eyes are, it was true. Romans were eating flamingo tongues. Ugh. Flamingos were associated with luxury, wealth. I mean, they are a strange color and it's close to purple. Romans love purple, and compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, it just doesn't really fit in. So yeah, sure, it makes sense. Well, the opulence in Rome loved flamingos and their tongues. My only hope is that they used all the birds. In my research, it said that poor citizens did when given the opportunity, but I just can't see the wealthy chopping tongues, and that's it. Hors d'oeuvres, anyone?
Number 7, daily acts. In a time before Twitter or Facebook, how else do we get our fake news, right? How do we share our aunt's nonsense? How do we do it? 131 BC, this marked the first time a newspaper was ever used. Well, they're referred to as daily acts at this point, or acta diurna. The saying, written in stone, couldn't have been more historically accurate in this case. See these texts containing information on military or civil issues, death notices, gladiatorial events, you name it, these were commonly written on metal or stone. Your morning news etched into a stone. Imagine the crossword section in 131 BC. Hey honey, who's the neighbor in Simpsons? Flanders, nice, that's it. Ping! Ping! Is that an F? Ping! It took time and effort. It was exhausting just to get one notice out to the public. So you best take these notes seriously, okay? Imagine YouTube comments written in stone. Took a guy 6 business days to write it, so he meant it.
Number 6, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a Roman general and statesman, a member of the first triumvirate. Caesar led the Roman armies in the Gallic Wars, which, well, we've seen and heard about these battles that Julius Caesar led. It's the organized outfit of shiny metal and red, moving slowly and swiftly through the Gauls like a man-made tank before defeating his political rival Pompey the Great, another military leader, and also the husband of Caesar's daughter Julia. Okay, there it is, yeah. That's why he became his nemesis. Political differences. Yeah. Due to these ongoing internal civil wars between the two leaders, Julius Caesar eventually killed Pompey in battle and became dictator of Rome. This was until his assassination in 44 BC. Oh, mighty Caesar, dost thou lie so low? Are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils shrunk to this little measure? Fare thee well. Antony, Act 3, Scene 1. Hey man, eye for an eye. You read the rules. He played a crucial role in the events that led to the Roman Empire and remains one of the brightest and bravest military leaders the world has ever seen. His story can be seen and heard top to tail in William Shakespeare's play simply titled Julius Caesar.
Number 5, basket of bees. Guess what this one is? It's pretty much, that's exactly what it is. It's horrible. We often look at ancient Rome as the birthplace for numerals, modern plumbing, social life, all that good stuff. Don't get it twisted, ancient Rome had a lot in common with the Dark Ages as well, okay? The punishments that they would inflict on others, horribly creative, I'll say that. Like for example, a basket of bees. A basket of bees, there we go. Maybe wasps, who knows, I don't know. History gets all crazy, you know? This punishment saw the victim placed in a large woven basket, naked, might I add. Then the basket was hoisted up near a beehive, of course, and then Romans would just anger the hive. They would just shake the basket. And then in turn, all these bees would sting said victim to death. This was meant to be a long and painful death, but eventually, this is how humans realized folks were allergic to bees, because they would meet their demise a little too fast, you know? Romans would be like, what happened? What's going on? Are we going home now? That's it?
Number 4, the Colosseum. They say Rome wasn't built in a day, right? Right? No, I'm asking you, I don't know, that's a saying, I think I've heard that somewhere. The word Colosseum is a Latin noun formed from the word colossus, meaning gigantic. And it's huge! It once held more than 50,000 people at one time or another. That's literally the Yankee Stadium. This oval stadium was built from cement, limestone, and volcanic rock. Yeah, that thing ain't going anywhere. Historians and archaeologists are still discovering and unearthing secrets of this site. In fact, most of Rome still hasn't even been dug up yet. What? That's right. In fact, only about a tenth lays discovered, with the other 90% still somewhere around 30 feet below street level. Who knows how many wonders of the world lay unearthed. The Colosseum, also known as the seventh wonder of the world, lays megalithic, 615 feet above the ground at the center or heart of the city. It is the largest ancient amphitheater ever built, and it is still the largest standing amphitheater in the world today despite its age. Its use for the last 1,000 years were rampant with events, festivals, and would even flood its center to reenact naval wars with real ships. How did they get those things in there? I bet that's how they made the bottle in the ship thing, just kinda. And all that water? Just a guy with a giant hose? Yeah, go ahead, turn it on. Yeah, we're gonna be here a while, guys. We gotta push the play.
Number 3, boot and rally. The Urban Dictionary added the old boot and rally back in 2002, but Romans, back in the ancient day, they were way ahead of us. Romans knew how to get down, and they also knew how to get it back up. Yeah, ancient Romans would boot and rally in order to continue eating and drinking. What would normally be a red flag at any house party or event was a sign of respect back then. These banquets, these were social events, okay? They were nothing like Tyler's toga party last Halloween. It's not the same at all. Same amount of puke, not the same theme. Attending these parties was a sign of social standing, so you wanted to be around the longest. You wanted to drink the most, dance the most, converse the most, and also, yeah, puke the most. No playing around in Rome, okay? I wouldn't last 2 hours at one of these. Kyle knows what's up, he's seen it. I bring Tums to the bar now, you know what I mean? I'm always prepared. The solution in ancient Rome was actually quite simple, long before Tums. See, what you would do is, you would excuse yourself from dinner, go across the hall to the vomitorium, then you'd grab a feather, any feather you like, and then you would just go, and then put it back, and then go right back to dinner. And then enjoy more lobster, because, hey, now you made room.
Number 2, Gladiators. If you've seen the blockbuster hit Gladiator with Russell Crowe, my name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, then you absolutely nailed it, because that's pretty well it. A stew of slaves, lawbreakers, and ex-soldiers, the Gladiator games were one of Rome's most brutal and vibrant live events. Gladiators would be held underground under the Colosseum until they would be called upon to spill the blood of both man and animal in sport. Fighters would be matched based on their size, previous record, skill level, style of fighting, and years of experience, just like the professional contact sports today. Fighting out of the red corner at 195 pounds, the reigning victor, Spartacus! Oh, you're Spartacus? Oh, sorry. No, you're Spartacus. Okay. But it wasn't all thumbs down for these fighters. Gladiators were the celebrities of their time. Yeah, you can take that. There you go. Okay, one. We'll do one. Some gladiators even fought years after earning their freedom. Those years did not seem to be that long, with the average lifespan of the gladiator though living just to their mid-20s. I mean, it's pretty physical. The event was not just to kill your opponent. In fact, months of training and preparation was had. There was more of a spectacle of sportsmanship then, most of the time wounding their enemy, which would lead to the slow demise of a fighter, usually ranging between anywhere from 8 to 10 fights in their whole career. Come on, dude. 50,000 people cheering you on at the Yankee Stadium? Kyle! 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 Oh, no, 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 no!
And finally, number 1, fast food. Imagine getting a Happy Meal in 45 BC. You just get a toy of like Spartacus, just like, oh, that's nice, I'll put it on the window. Romans were indulging in fast food before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 BC. They were having a good time until they weren't. Archaeologists recently excavated a thermopolium in the ruins of what was once thriving city of Pompeii. We found a snack bar in 2019 and it's since been reopened. Yeah, you can now pick up shifts once again at this restaurant that was open thousands of years ago. As of last August, the restaurant, located at the intersection of Silver Wedding Street and Alley of Balconies, they would serve pork, snails, beef, fish, you name it, and the corner also doubled down and crushed fava beans, more often than not mixing them with wine. So it was a good time, it was social. This was bumping on a Saturday night. The closest thing we have to ancient restaurants in Canada now is like coffee time. I don't know, every coffee time in Canada looks like it was damaged by Mount Vesuvius. Looks abandoned. The walls are broken in, nobody's working. I'm like, can I get a coffee? Hi, hello?
And the wedding traditions of both ancient Rome and the ones of our modern day, we need to learn about number 10, the women of Sabine. So if you haven't seen it yet, we recently released the top 10 messed up marriage traditions in ancient Rome, and I definitely recommend giving these 2 videos a watch consecutively. As in that one, you'll learn more about the traditions and the ceremony itself. This video, more nitty gritty, baby. So, to recap, this story first takes place when Rome was first established, like fresh off the press, just a small military settlement in 753 BCE. As a result, its entire population was men, which, don't get me wrong, Roman soldiers could work with the same way Greek ones could, but because their mommies had done all the work for them their entire lives and now they can't wash dishes or even a shirt, they sought out replacement mommies, aka wives. Where and how do you get wives when there are no women? The answer to that question was to steal any women of childbearing age from the neighboring township of Sabine. These women were ripped from their mothers and fathers and carried in large processions back to Rome, where they were forced into marriage via physicality. Their fathers, brothers, and former husbands came to wage war and win the women back, but the women of Sabine felt it was too late. Now forced into motherhood and marriage to the soldiers, the women of Sabine throw themselves in between the evil men who are now the fathers of their children and the men who they'd been stolen from, begging that bloodshed end, wanting to live neither fatherless nor widowed. So a truce is called, and Sabine and Rome united their communities. So let's do a traditional breakdown in the following part of the countdown. What traditions ended up coming from this? Number 9 will be stolen goods. So one result of Rome literally starting off as a mass theft of ladies and their autonomy, it developed a super fun mindset and tradition that the only bride of value was one that hadn't been deflowered and had been stolen from her family. This went in 2 directions. So first, marriage continued to be theft, not like a ha ha ha, steal the bride. This was like actual theft of a person and a forceful marriage. This is how it was in the early days of Rome for a few hundo years. Obviously, it can't stay that way forever because people do feel love and some people want to get married in a non-effed up way, so the tradition goes the second way. That theft would be continued, but as a consenting reenactment. In a consenting reenactment after the marriage ceremony, a bride would hug her father, then hold her mother, at which point the guests and the groomsmen would pull her from her mother's arms in a recreation of what happened to the Sabines, and that she should cry out in pain and weep as she was heralded along the route to her new house, even if they were faking it, just as the Sabines had. And that's when number 8 comes in, the best man. So before the theft was a reenactment and it was still the real deal stuff, the best man and or groomsmen were crucial. If a bride's family was to steal back their daughter before the consummation occurs, this man or men's purpose was to literally guard the bride and fight her family. That's why he was called a best man. He was usually whatever man the groom knew who was best at fighting. And if he didn't want to risk getting his own butt kicked, well, he better bring his groomsmen. The more, the better. According to Country Living, the presence of groomsmen and best men was also to ensure that the bride, who in many situations was literally stolen, didn't make a break for it herself. This is why the best man stands up there next to the groom and bride instead of behind the door frame with a baseball bat, waiting for his homie's new father-in-law to come break down the door. If a fight's going to break out, you need your best fighter right there ready to go, or to tackle a runaway bride.
Number 7, gladiator fights. We just did a video on this, Taylor and I, go check it out. Now, parties weren't just about eating, drinking, and socializing, there had to be entertainment, of course. Roman parties were designed around the 5 senses: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. So of course there were the ancient Roman bards jamming out some earworms, but what was there to look at? You could only watch someone play the harp for so long. Next up on the entertainment list was acrobats, dancing girls, even mimes, which I was surprised to learn, plus trained exotic animals. If you were more like the charcuterie and like a quiet evening kind of person, you might enjoy poetry readings. But what really got the party started was an epic gladiatorial battle. Nothing like putting sharp objects in drunk people's hands. But that wasn't all they did. Parties were a big deal and nobles loved to outdo each other, so sometimes they went too far. More than once it got out of hand, but the most famous was during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus. He wanted to shower his dinner guests with flowers, so he built a false ceiling filled with them, but the flowers somehow ended up smothering some of his guests to death because he just kind of went overboard. Death by Roses. That's a poem title right there. Stick to poetry nights, my friends. Number 6, Saturnalia. One of the most popular Roman festivals. It was kind of like an early Christmas celebration, kind of, except it wasn't at all. It was actually about the god Saturn, not Christ. Oops, but it did take place in December 17th to be precise, for 3 days. But people loved it so much, it soon got extended to 7, a whole week. All work and businesses were suspended, so better do your shopping on the 16th. Slaves were even temporarily free to do as they pleased, even moral restrictions were eased. A mock king was chosen, and candles, wax fruit, wax statues were all given as presents. The practice of candle giving was to symbolize the sun returning after the winter solstice. A statue of Saturn bound at the feet would be untied and invited to join the party. The houses were adorned with wreaths and greenery, kinda like Christmas, and singing, dancing, gambling were all common features, so kind of like Mardi Gras and Christmas combined. Number 5, the Black Banquet. A prank that went down in history. Don't worry, this is nothing like GOT's Red Wedding, thank goodness. Emperor Decimation had a pretty sick sense of humor and decided to host a party about it. In 90 AD, he invited a crowd of aristocrats to a banquet at Palatine Hill. When they arrived, the entire palace was decorated in black. Black velvet drapes, marble, everything was painted black, like the Rolling Stones song. Even the food was black and everything was illuminated by funeral lamps. Naked serving boys were painted from head to toe in black paint and served food and drink to all the guests. When they sat down, their place marks were tombs with their names on it, and instead of lush couches, they sat on cement slabs. So basically he was like, yeah, sit in your own grave. Decimation had killed several senators in the past, so everyone believed that they were never going to get out of there alive. It was like a huge metaphor for their own deaths. The emperor himself babbled about death and decay the entire night, so after the party was over and the guests made it home with their necks intact, Decimation sent gift baggies with their tombstones and onyx plates, and a now clean serving boy ready to do their bidding. Turns out the whole thing was a prank and the emperor was back at the palace laughing his butt off. Number 4, Bacchanalia. The party that was so wild, it got banned. One word, orgies. The Romans dug that kind of kinky shindig, but they like to pretend they didn't. Bacchanalia, the back guy, is a term used to describe a drunken, debaucherous party at frat houses or sororities, which isn't far off from the heyday. The Bacchanal celebrates the god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus, literally the god of wine and a damn good time. The celebration could include massive feasts, ritual parades and performances, and people carrying clusters of grapes around, and of course, wine. Lots and lots of wine. It used to just be held by women 3 times a year, but soon men were slowly admitted to the festivities and they started making it happen about 5 times a month. But this was the breeding ground for scandal, as it was rumored orgies and even human sacrifice occurred. So they were banned in 186 BCE, and if you ban something, you'll only make it more popular, so the celebrations continued covertly. So if you're into that kind of stuff, maybe forgo the human sacrifice, but there it is. Number 3, power play party. I've never lived within the aristocracy. I'm a blue-collar gal. I'm never gonna know what it's like to be that rich. But I'm pretty sure this kind of who can throw the bigger party mentality hasn't really changed. In ancient Rome, parties were an opportunity to show off the amount of power a nobleman had. As soon as guests arrived, the extravagance and the rarity of the food, the vessels with which they were presented, were all judged as soon as they were seen. Wine goblets and jugs had to be functional yet exquisite, made from luxurious materials like gold, silver, and precious stones. Back then, a middle-class family could afford silverware, so imagine what the nobles could do. This display of wealth played the long game, and it could mean political favors could be made down the road. So, sneaky sneaky. Number 2, Party Island. This is where it gets really dark. Ever sipped on a Capri Sun? Well, this story may taint that memory, so fair warning. The island of Capri became a rich retreat for the Roman aristocracy, known for its sadistic debauchery. Emperor Tiberius laid claim to this island as a haven for his horrendous and horrific behavior. He brought really young, too young male and female people of the night to serve him at his villa. The island became a kind of party place with absolutely no limits. From orgies in the caves to tormenting his servants on the rack as entertainment, Tiberius seemed to be the god Pan incarnate. In fact, he acted like it too. He made all of his participants slaves dress up as nymphs and goats while performing lewd acts. The island even became known as Goat Island, with Tiberius being called the Old Goat. Ugh. Unless you enjoy dangerous games and gross parties, this definitely wasn't the party island fit for anyone. And last but not least, number 1, Caligula. Caligula's parties. Let's not go there. If you're a fan of Roman history, then you are familiar with the 2 most horrific emperors that ever were. One of them was Caligula. Though he started out pretty good, after an extreme bout of fever, his disposition entirely changed. Maybe it was because of the lead, we don't know. Many believed he was insane, as his cruelty knew no bounds, even when it came to joyous occasions. Caligula's thing was that he liked to embarrass the wives of his officials for some reason, and also his officials. He would force specifically married couples to his banquets, and then steal the wives away throughout the night and then violate them against their wishes. But his torment doesn't end there. He would then relay to the entire party everything that he did in graphic detail and enjoy the frozen shock on everyone's faces because they couldn't do anything about it. It's no wonder he was eventually assassinated. Even at a party, this guy knew how to kill the mood. He wasn't the only emperor to turn the dial on creepy, Tiberius, when the party started, but if you had to choose whose party to go to, this one plus Tiberius, both of them, just don't go near them. Go to another time frame. Just imagine it otherwise.
Number 10. We're making a video about mysteries from ancient Rome, and you think I'm not gonna talk about Pompey's own Villa of Mysteries? You balkin', mate, you balkin'! The Villa of Mysteries was discovered back in 1909 after being buried at Pompeii. One of the more mysterious finds was a wall fresco that depicts what could be a play or wedding, or maybe an initiation ceremony to an ancient Roman cult known as the Cult of Dionysus. We don't really know anything about what this cult actually did. They were obviously very good at keeping things under wraps. What happens in the cult stays in the cult. Or however that saying goes, I don't really remember. No one was allowed to know what happened in their initiation, rituals, or really anything. I mean, they weren't even allowed to write it down. But if that was the case, why was someone allowed to paint it on a wall? Make it make sense, bro. Make it make sense. Number 9, family traits. I think this one is kind of really interesting. There is a village in western China where the people who all live here, meaning their families are all historically from here, have blue eyes and blonde hair. While not exactly uncommon, I guess, the sheer amount of people specifically from here that have these particular traits that are different from the black hair and dark eye color of most people in China suggests that everyone who is native to this area may actually be descended from an ancient Roman legion. I have the blood of a legionnaire flowing through these veins! That'd be so cool. In 53 BC, Marcus Crassus lost pretty badly in a fight in what is modern-day Afghanistan. It's believed that the Roman soldiers that survived traveled as mercenaries, just trying to make a few bucks, and they apparently wandered as far as this village in western China. DNA tests on the villagers of this area actually do show that they are 50% Caucasian, which is super interesting, but we don't know for sure if it was these traveling for sale legionnaires that were the cause. And maybe I'm just a silly goose, but I don't even know how we would be able to find that out with some kind of archaeological evidence. Number 8. Misleading. In 2010, we discovered a coffin in the city of Gabi. A coffin made of lead. It was also, interestingly enough, in the shape of a burrito, giving it the nickname Lead Burrito. You won't be seeing me going into Chipotle to ask for that one. Yes, I'll take one lead burrito, extra deceased Roman inside, please and thank you. No. The University of Michigan, the ones who led the expedition that found the coffin, said that lead coffins like this are extremely rare. But on top of that, this one specifically is incredibly heavy, like 1,000 pounds, letting us know exactly how expensive it must have been. The mysterious part comes to play when we realize we have absolutely no clue whatsoever who the adult man inside this coffin is. We know he was around at the time of Nero, but there is no evidence inside this burrito about the life this man lived. No extra toppings in this burrito, just lead and meat. Yum.
Number 7, garum. Alright, if you're like me, you're a meat and potatoes kind of guy. When I was growing up, and I probably will be until I'm 80 in a senior home, that's just the way I am. Now, that being said, you can't have hockey pucks on the barbecue without her best friend, her luscious red lover, Heinz number 57 ketchup. Am I right, Chris? Oh, of course. Exactly. And yes, Mom, I can tell the difference, thank you very much. Well, meet the Roman ketchup that would be included at a lot of meals, almost all of them apparently. Garum, you take fish blood and fish guts and you pack a whole bunch of salt into it and stir it up until it looked like the forbidden tomato paste. You spread that bad boy out on a wooden plank, let it dry out in the sun for a week, and bada bing bada boom baby, you're in Rome. You got yourself an apparent delicious condiment for every meal. Apparently it was at a lot of meals, which is... can't imagine that being very good. Salted fish guts. Oof. Number 6, ostrich. I like chicken just as much as the next guy. Matter of fact, maybe I like it more than the next guy. Any chef will tell you a fresh and properly prepared chicken goes a long way. You can make soup, stew, pasta, fried chicken, baked barbecue, roasted chicken, casserole, chicken burgers. I mean, she's flexible. You can do a lot of stuff, and she's just so versatile. Now, the question is ostrich as flexible? I doubt it. They were an exotic bird even back then, and apparently one emperor liked to shoot their heads with arrows for fun. That was part of the fun and games, yay. Okay, sometimes I can't believe the stuff I read. I'd say this is probably the second least grossest thing on the list, but I don't even know where to get ostrich. And honestly, to even try, I feel like a weirdo googling that. Where do I get ostrich meat? I don't know. That just doesn't feel right. Number 5, lamb brains. Ooh, gross. Okay, lambs are not my favorite, but it's not that bad. I can see why people like it. The right preparation would yield a delicious and nutritious meal. Especially like roasted over a fire or something. I hear lamb's pretty good that way. I've never had it that way, but I hear it's good. Lamb's brains, however, I don't know, man. Remember that scene from Hannibal where Anthony Hopkins cuts open the skull from the guy from Goodfellas and you get to see inside his brain and how a good fella thinks? The mafia joke. Oh look, there's the prefrontal cortex. Look at all those memories of beatings and extortion. Oh wow. All jokes aside, it's a gross scene. And I can't help but not forget about it when thinking of lamb brains. Well, the Romans, they loved them. Romans enjoyed lamb brains in a variety of ways, from cured, boiled, baked, and more. One Apicius recipe even calls for lamb brain, eggs, pepper, and rose petals. So you never have too many rose petals. Number 4, sow's womb. It's exactly how it sounds. I know, it's just another part of the animal, but some pieces, well, they just don't taste like the other do. They kinda taste worse. And when there's no yieldy Taco Bell, your options get stretched thinner than a contortionist who's out of a job and working street corners. So it makes sense to use all the parts of the animal, which I certainly hope they are. I certainly wouldn't want any to go to waste. While not as common as other dishes on this list, you would find the sow's womb prepared with various spices and oftentimes a mixture of vinegar and honey. I don't know if those go together. I don't know if that's, and I think sow is, I believe, is pig, by the way, too. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Pig or a hog or something like that, sorry. Number 3, giraffe. I mean, okay, such peaceful animals and just all necks. Is neck even that good to eat? I don't know. Has anyone ever had giraffe before? I don't know. Another animal considered to be very exotic for the time, even back then. Sometimes they would even find their way into the arena to fight themselves or other animals like lions. Kinda crazy. If you've ever seen a giraffe fight before, you know how brutal they can be. It's basically who can whip their neck back and forth the hardest and the fastest. Scientists uncovering artifacts from an ancient restaurant in Pompeii found remains of a giraffe leg, so it actually may be more common than we think it was. Number 2, jellyfish. Squidward. There's only two things I know about jellyfish. One, in SpongeBob, jellyfish produce a most delicious jelly, hence the name, and that goes on a Krabby Patty. Remember that episode? It's one of my favorites. Two, jellyfish got some nasty stingers, some of which can prove to be lethal, and no amount of Bear Grylls knowledge and urine can save you. He pees on them. I saw him do it once, and now I always remember that if I get to pee on it, but apparently that's not how you do it. Anyway, jellyfish were most likely not eaten every day on everyone's diet. However, there are mentions of it in some Roman writings. Apicius' cookbook is the best collection of ancient Roman recipes to ever survive. It mentions of a jellyfish omelet as an appetizer. Although I gotta say, I don't know if jelly and egg go together like that. Chris is saying no too. That's a weird one. Number 1, blood pudding. Oof. This one I know that we still eat today and some cultures love it, but there's just something about the blood for me, personally. I can't get over it. I get lightheaded thinking about blood and the taste. Well, I think I'd rather suck on an iron girder. Well, I called the chief, who was a world-class chef, and he said, it ain't it. Roman blood pudding, or sausage, was prepared by mixing a very readily available resource of lifeblood and fat and oats to make for a very loving, tasty meal. Oh god. Sometimes it was even put into sausage form with animal innards. Just cause, go ahead, fry those bad boys up. Cook them up for me. You love this. Oh, I can't even say it, dude. It's so gross. Just go ahead and cook those bad boys up. It sounds great. I promise I won't puke at the dinner table.
To us. Let's start with not consummating our marriage. In the Roman Republic, there was a custom saying that if the bride was a virgin, her husband should only sleep beside her or holding her without having intercourse for at least the first night of the marriage. The aim was to give the woman a chance to get used to the new situation, especially since marriage occurred young, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but women were raised to be very, very, very good mothers and housekeepers, but they were never actually raised to be lovers or partners. It's why so many societies in history we've seen abundance of brothels and working girls, and a widespread acceptance of men seeking out infidelity. Their partners couldn't suit their needs because they didn't know how, but women without the job of being their wives could. Unfortunately, this very sweet just cuddle first night practice degenerated over time. Some men forced themselves on their wives. The custom disappeared thanks to the male ego, and everybody agreed on the whole intercourse during the first wedding night thing. So a newfound tradition took root. Before the consummation, maybe a day or so before the wedding or the day of, a Roman woman would have to go through the process of deflowering. In order to do that, she was taken to the Mutinous Temple on Vielia, where she would sit on the rod of Mutinous Temple, the marriage deity. Anyways, after sitting on it, she doesn't have to do anything more than that if she does not want to. The bride-to-be was successfully deflowered, and she was able to go have intercourse with her husband later. This strange custom supposedly derives from the Romans' belief that the first penetration, being with the deity, would guarantee fertility and healthy children. Next up is a poisonous cocktail. It was named after the maker of the poison, Mithridates the Great, whose father had been smoked by poisoned food at a banquet. Between that and the plots his mom and bro devised against him, Mithridates began a long process of gradually administering himself incrementally larger doses of all the poisons, toxins, and venoms he could find, in hopes of slowly building up his immunity against them. The blend was known as Mithridatium. Seeing as he lived into his 80s, homeboy may have been onto something, and it seems that other Roman leaders agree with me with that. The story goes that assuming that he was now invulnerable to all threats, the young king became belligerent and power drunk, and in 88 BC launched an ultimately flawed campaign against the entirety of the Roman Empire, and it turned into a war that lasted 25 years. Mithridates eventually loses and flees to the Armenian countryside with one of his guards. Knowing that if the Romans found him alive, his kingdom would fall, Mithridates reportedly attempts to poison himself, but he's immune. Instead, he's forced to demand his guards stab him to death. In an attempt to ensure that he could not be killed by poison, Mithridates had apparently guaranteed himself a bloody and violent death instead. Naturally, Roman emperors got a hold of this poison mix and followed suit in his path. But that's not all they're willing to consume. Next is piss for everything. Where we see a porta potty, the Romans see dollar signs. In Rome, most of the citizenry's sewage ended up in the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems. From here, urine was collected and thanks to its ammonia content was sold as a chemical used in laundry and tanning leather. Outside of Rome itself, full-ons, Roman dry cleaners, would visit the toilets and collect urine as well. Pause. How did they separate the urine from the feces? Was there certain toilets for certain ones and pipes that kept them separate? Or was it all one chute and they strained out the solid matter? In which case that would be a lot more than just pee in that liquid. But let's not go down that rabbit hole that I don't want to think about. Urine became such a big business that Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 AD, began taxing it. When his son Titus complained of the disgusting way his father was making coin, Vespasian told his son to smell a gold coin. Then he asked him if it stank. When his son replied that it didn't, the emperor replied, "Yet it comes from urine." Oh, call that dirty money you just got owned, son. Even Emperor Nero passed a urine tax, which everyone had to pay if they want to use a public bathroom. So what else are they using it for? Mouthwash for whitening your teeth, growing juicy fruits like pomegranates and citrus, washing their togas, curing diseased animals, fertilizing lands, tanning leather, or their own skin. No shortage of piss potential in Rome.
Number 7. The Crassus cocktail. I love a good drink at the end of the day. Just getting a little mix here and there, it's just so fun. Ooh, if it's good, man, just caps off a hard day of work. It seems like Crassus was a man of similar taste, a general and a statesman who'd earned the title the richest man in Rome. Dude ran a bunch of wars, serious campaigns, and his last was against the Parthians, primarily because he was just kind of bent out of shape that the other generals were outshining him in the field. Unfortunately, Crassus's forces were absolutely slaughtered, and when his son Publius ended up being one of the casualties of war, Crassus went to parley. Negotiations went sour, and he and his entire party were wiped out. Apparently, after such a rough day, the Parthians figured that Crassus could use a little something to take the edge off, so they had him take a sip of molten gold. Fun fact, the melting point of gold is about 1064 degrees Celsius. Yeah, that'll have a kick. Number 6. The fall of Emperor Valerian. One of the later emperors of Rome, Valerian rose to power simply and ruled simply. Went to war a few times, killed a bunch of Christians, got beat up by Goths, basic Roman stuff. So when Valerian was captured by Cameo of Shapur I, it boggles the mind why they went as far as they did in making sure that this dude wasn't just defeated, they made sure his entire genetic code wouldn't survive the humiliation he received. First on the menu was for the Shapur to use him as a footstool while mounting their horses. He was then given the Crassus special, a big old bowl of molten gold right down the gullet, which may or may not have happened while he was simultaneously being alive. His skin was then allegedly stuffed with straw and dyed, hung in the Persian temple for all to see. Seriously, the dude just didn't like Christians. Chill. Number 5. Gaius Valerius Catullus rap battle. Who doesn't love a good beef? Now, Catullus was a major poet, his works moving away from the retelling of classic tales and focusing more on the telling of day-to-day life. The personal nature of his works have lived in the minds of thousands, depicting humor, romance, and the beauty of day-to-day life. However, Catullus was no stranger to critics, 2 of his biggest being another poet, Furius, and Senator Aurelius. Now, constructive critique can be wonderful for artists. After all, it's the only way that you can improve. However, Catullus seemed to take a different view, writing a poem in dedication to his critics. Commonly referred to as Catullus 16, this poem was so filthy that it wasn't fully translated until the 20th century, and even then, several lines were heavily censored in most publications. Want to hear it? Well, it reads... Number 4. Roman birth control. Romans were... well, they got around a lot. Now, unless you want to deal with the immediate consequences of a whole lot of lovin', you've gotta figure out a way to stay safe. Picking up condoms from a shopper's wasn't really a thing, and Plan B hadn't been invented yet, so what was the plan? Well, it turned out that the Romans had discovered an herb called silphium, which supposedly had contraceptive properties. Whether or not that's actually true remains to be seen, specifically due to the fact that you can't find it anymore. That's right, the Romans were so raunchy and Silphium was so popular that they caused the complete extinction of the plant, the last stalk of it reportedly being given to Emperor Nero. Now in 2020 there has been a theory presented that there is a similar herb, or a relative, found in Turkey, and it could be the surviving relative of the plant, but to this day not a sprig of Silphium has been found. Apparently it looks like a heart though. Aww. Ecological devastation. Number 3. Roman baths. The terms made its way around. Roman baths are synonymous with the country and culture as a symbol of civilization. But you've listened to enough of this list so far, so you can probably figure out where this is going. See, while Romans were known for their hygiene, urine laundry aside, they were usually pretty nasty when it came to bath time. Soap wasn't really a thing, so the baths were basically just huge vats of oil that they just slather up all in there. Now these oils were perfumed, but they were also reused frequently and were washed off using a strigil, a sort of scraping tool, so you know, just spoon the dirt off. Ugh. Number 2. Cato the Younger. Alright. Here's a fun one. Marcus Porcius Cato, also known as Cato the Younger, was a Roman senator in the later years of Rome. A hugely influential man. His life was fraught with turmoil and strife. He was also a strong opposer of Julius Caesar's Hellenistic principles. Cato had no trouble joining the opposition on the brewing civil war. Now, during that civil war, Cato took command of a campaign in Utica, a tough campaign that he generally just planned to abandon alongside the Roman Empire. However, once they'd been defeated, Caesar moved to pardon Cato's family and allies. Convinced his end was drawing near, Cato took his life against his friends' and family's advice, stabbing himself in the abdomen. Now, some accounts claim that he actually drew out his own entrails from his body when the physicians attempted to heal him, ensuring that he wouldn't see Caesar's Rome. Maybe he knew that Caesar was planning to pardon him as well, which Cato would have considered the crueler punishment. Number 1. Caligula's horse. We'd be remiss not to talk about the antics of Emperor Caligula. Famed for his strange ways, one of the greatest legends of an already infamous emperor was his attempt to have his favored horse, Incitatus, enlisted as a consul. According to Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, this horse was dressed in lush finery, inviting dignitaries to dinners, and according to Cassius Dio, the horse was fed oats mixed with gold flakes and also possibly a priest. Now, a lot of this is left up to debate, and a number of historians will argue that this was nothing more than a prank at the expense of the Senate. While never officially made a consul, this horse has lived on in infamy, inspiring a number of fictional depictions in modern media, including the metal band Caligula's Horse. Regardless of the official status of the horse, the truth seems to be that this was nothing more than an attempt to mock his senators, but what a method of mockery.